Yeah! Welcome back to what I've chosen to call a history of rock and roll in film. And rock and roll. You may call it what you like. Now, this is a very special one for me. I started researching it, more than a year and a half ago. As with the Chuck Berry episode, it is part one of at least two. As with the Chuck Berry episode, I got skittish and nervous about committing to it too soon and put it off for a long time. So, I mean, the Chuck Berry episode is not so much the first one. I did that one fairly early in the feed, but part two has been a long time coming. I have a million sections of Chuck's autobiography bookmarked and have had for a couple of years, and it just feels like a mountain of information I need to parse out in the right sort of proportions. And I think getting through Little Richard will help me sort of feel more confident about tackling that one again. Because with Chuck and with Richard, I just don't want to screw this up. I don't want to leave the wrong things out. Granted, it is my show, and if I decide I want to add things in later in a newer episode, I of course will. But I appreciate you being here if you're here for the history of rock and roll, if you're here for Little Richard specifically. I hope it leads to you checking out some other stuff in the feed. It's all evergreen content. It is not based around any current events or entertainment events. So scroll back through. If you're here because you did a search for Little Richard, then I hope you find some of the other topics interesting as well. Conversely, if you are, someone who is more into the recent Van Halen and Guns N' Roses episodes, thanks for checking this one out. I hope a deep dive into more rock and roll history is the kind of thing that will turn you on. Thanks also just for including me in a good part of your day. I hope this is something that's helping you enjoy maybe a bike ride or a walk or doing the dishes, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's a crappy part of your day like your morning commute, and I'm helping you get through it. That'd be nice. I appreciate that. Thanks for being here and giving a damn about rock and roll and about movies. Today's movie is a bit of an oddball because it's made for television, but I would assume that Richard was trying to get a full biopic, theater release kind of thing for a long time. But this is what they got, and I think all things considered, my view of it was very positive after a little bit of standoffishness at the beginning. So if you are not familiar with the format of the show, you will be listening to me going through the history of Little Richard's development and career, for the early days, and I will cover some more of his peak commercial period in the next episode, but that will be intermingled with observations about the film that I'm covering, the Little Richard biopic from 2000, and starring Leon, and I will also break those segments up with interstitial music recorded by myself here in my living room very spontaneously because it's riffs I was trying to come up with and figure out for one of my bands, but I have been too lazy to commit them to song form. So you get to hear them in the meantime, and I appreciate you being here for that because, quite frankly, with the download numbers being what they are, I'm reaching a much larger audience here than I would if I was playing these songs in a club in Seattle presently. Now, enough with the pleasantries, enough with the to-do and the falderall, enough with the grandstanding and hot dogging. Let us get into Little Richard's early history in his own words. I think unlike a lot of episodes of A History of Rock and Roll and Film and Rock and Roll, this one might be fairly chronological because as the main source of historical information, I am going straight to the life and times of Little Richard, the authorized biography by Charles White. The structure of the book is a bit janky in places. There's some chunks that are written by Mr. Charles White, writing directly to you as the reader, talking about how things were going in Little Richard's life and how important the things he was doing were. It's very pointed in places like, this is important. He's the best. He's the king. He brought all the people together. He's the reason you have Mick Jagger and Michael Jackson and all these other, superstars. But then, the majority of it seems to be Richard's words, like straight from him. And I have bookmarks on no less than probably 50 pages as I'm looking at this. I started this one a long time ago, and I was scared to do it too soon. I have to admit that. I was scared to cover Little Richard too soon and blow it and leave something out. So while I won't be going through every single thing I've bookmarked in this and reading it verbatim, if you're familiar with my show, I will read things in my own interpretation, or I will present them in my own interpretation. And then some parts I will just have to read straight off the page. And this is one of those times. This is the early years. This is his early recollections of family. He says, and as an adult man, well into his, I don't know how old he was in 84. I got to assume 50-ish without looking it up. My daddy was one of those progressive types of people. I was going to say, he calls his mom and dad daddy, and I think he says mama, mother, my mother. He refers to her as my mother, but he has like a pet name, I think, for his grandma. My daddy was one of those progressive types of people. Everyone had gas lamps. We had electric light. My daddy's family wasn't educated like my mama's, though. My mama came from a family that was wealthy and educated. A very fair-skinned set of people. I think there was Indian blood in them. My nanny had long silver hair down to here and high cheekbones. And the author doesn't intervene to tell you down to here what that means visually, like where he's probably placing his hand down somewhere like halfway down his back. I don't know. Or to his knees, for all I know. It just says down to here. Good work, editors. Good work, Omnibus Press and Charles White. My gosh. My mother's daddy was real light, had white silver hair too. When you look at mother, you can see it. When I was a little bitty boy, Granddaddy had a big old electric range where everybody else had wood-burning stoves and 2 living rooms with glass doors. That's the house my mama was raised in. I remember the first time I went there. I couldn't believe it. I used to love to go there and just look. Everything was so cool. He had a bathtub the water ran into. At our home, we were still bathing in 2 little tin tubs. My mother had all these kids, and I was the only one born deformed. My right leg is shorter than the left, and I didn't realize that my leg was small. I never knew about it. Yet, looking back, I can see why my mother and them was always so careful about me, because they knew something I didn't. My mother used to let me get away with so much. I lived through a lot, and a lot of it was the way I walked. The kids didn't realize I was crippled. They thought I was trying to twist and walk feminine. But I had to take short steps because I had a little leg. I used to walk with odd strides, like long, short, long, short. The kids would call me faggot, sissy, freak, punk. They called me everything. One time my brother Peyton said to me, "Oh, Richard, where'd you get this body? Boy, you got a curious body." And I said to Mother, "Why is it that one of my legs is shorter than the other?" She answered, "Shut up, boy. You go and get the dishes washed and don't worry about it." But I wanted to hear someone talk about it. I wanted some explanation. I had this great big head and little body, and I had one big eye and one little eye. But God gave me a strong mind and a strong will. I've always had a fierce determination to excel. If we were cleaning the yard, I would try to make my part better. It was like I had to, because I was in competition with my brothers, and they were all good looking. Wow. Isn't that something? That'll do a number on you as a kid. That will do a number on you. Not being told, not being talked about, your deformedness, your off-balancedness when you walk being a signature thing people make fun of you for and your family doesn't talk about why it's there. And to have your value entrenched in how much effort you put in because you see people around you looking normal and you can't be like them. You're just going to get hounded for being the way you are physically. I'm sure that translated into future behavior in other ways, being how he was as a person, not physically, but, being a gay man in a world that you're not supposed to do that. Maybe that helped him with being flamboyant and more provocative anyway, because he was like, he got shit on as a kid just for something he couldn't control. So what are you going to do to him? Later on, like, yeah, I'm an adult and I'm acting out and I'm living the way I want to live and acting the way I want to act. I've already been punished for something that wasn't my choice anyway. So I'm gonna be even bigger and louder about this other element of myself that's not my choice. He goes on to say, I was the one at home that everybody thought was a nut. I would do some silly things, like when Mother was cooking and I would slip a piece of chicken in my pants pocket and burn my thigh. Or she'd send me out to do the washing and I'd just throw the clothes in the water and wring them out. I had everybody dirty for a week. Mama didn't trust my washing or my cooking. She'd say, bro, all the family called me that. They didn't say brother, they'd say bro. You're a nasty cook. I used to give people rocks and things as presents, but I once did something worse than that. You ready? You ready for this? I had a bowel movement in a box, in a shoebox or something like that, and I packed it up like a present and gave it to an old lady next to Mathis Groceries on Monroe Street in Pleasant Hill. I went to her on her birthday and said, Ms. Ola, how you been? And she said, oh, Richard, I feel so fine. Richard, you're such a nice child. I said, Ms. Ola, I've just come to wish you a happy birthday, and I brought you a present. Look, she said, oh, thank you so much. She took this big old shoebox with the stuff in it. I went off and waited around the corner of the house to listen for her reactions. I was hoping that she would open it while the other ladies were there, and she did. She wanted to show them what I brought her. She said, let us see what Richard has brought for me. Then I just heard someone say, I'm going to kill him. I'll kill him. She was crippled, but she leaped off the porch and was walking around without her stick. I laughed like a cuckoo. God bless Miss Ola. She's dead now. Me and my cousin Bertha Ray, we used to run together. We were a little team, a little evil, devilish team. I used to call her Boodlum. She had a big old black scar on her face because she had fallen and cut her face. And all the old people back then, they didn't take her to the doctor. They just took some soot out of the stove and packed it on her face, and it got well. It turned black, though. That's what they used to do in those days. Well, me and Boodlum were going past Mathis Groceries, and there was this big padlock hanging open on the door. I said, well, we might as well lock him up in there. So we locked him up in his own store. One day we went up the hill, saw my daddy's car parked, the old Model T Ford, and we said, well, we might as well push it on down the hill. So we pushed it, and we jumped in, and we were going to drive it, but it was going so fast that we had to jump out and let it roll on down the hill. We were always looking for things to do. I did my no manners, defecated, in a jar. I think that's a great term that needs to come back, don't you? No manners. I don't know why. I just used to like to do things in jars and boxes and stuff. I did some in a jelly jar, and I did it very neatly. And I closed up the jar, and I put it up on the cabinet with my mother's preserves. As soon as she found it, she yelled, Richard! She didn't call out for anyone else. She knew it was me. I was crazy, crazy. I didn't know why I did all these awful things. Mama used to complain to the ladies who came around to the house, I don't know why he does such evil, dirty things like that. It must be the devil. One lady put the bad mouth on me, like putting on a curse that I would die at 21. I always thought that I would never live past 21 because she had told me I would die. I always believed that, but it just made me wilder. Yeah, that's going to backfire on you. Yeah, you got a kid acted out and say, oh, now you're on borrowed time. It's over when you're 21. You're going to fuck things up as hard as you can until you're 21 then, aren't you? God, old people, don't be so dumb. Be wise like they are in the movies. For crying out loud. And he talks about going to school for the first time, how important it was to him. He had a lot of friends. He didn't trust any of them, though, he says. All the kids call me Big Head. The boys would want to fight me because I didn't like to be with them. I wanted to play with the girls. See, I felt like a girl. I used to play house with my cousins, and I'd say, I'm the mama. And they'd say, hey, Richard, you was the mama yesterday. But I wanted to be the mama, you know? So the boys wouldn't play with me because I've been saying stuff like that. I had always loved mother more than daddy. I think it was because my mother was just so close to me. I just wanted to be like her. I loved her so much. I idolized her. Every movement, I just used to love it when she put powder on her face. I used to watch her. I'd later sneak up into her bedroom and just sit there, putting rose water and stuff on myself. I'd imitate the things she said and the way she said them. She'd say, ooh, it's so hot. And then I would go outside and sit with my friends and I'd say, ooh, it's so hot. I would practice it. I just felt that I wanted to be a girl more than a boy. I knew I was different from the other boys as I got older. My cousin had a boyfriend by the name of Junior. I loved that guy. Many of the boys had crushes on other boys as friends. But mine was a whole thing. Sorry, the whole thing. I loved that guy all the way. I loved him just like a girl would love her boyfriend, and the same as a man would love a woman. My affection was not natural. It was very unnatural, but I didn't realize it then. And here we got a break and, acknowledge the fact that he's writing this in the 1980s as a person who has, given a lot of his adult life to the church. And it's a shame that he feels like, or has been made to feel like he has to say that his feelings were unnatural and wrong. That sucks. But of course, it makes sense in the context that he grew up in and where America was still at, even in the mid-'80s when, there's a whole thing with the not jumping to get involved in the whole AIDS crisis and find any medical treatments for it. So more gay people could die during the Reagan administration. But I will leave that to more knowledgeable people. Obviously, if you want to know more about it and you don't know what I'm referencing, there's plenty of YouTube videos and podcasts and books. Mid-'80s, still pretty bad time to be gay, publicly. So, we're going to get into some pretty heavy stuff sexually here. I feel like you should know, but I don't feel like listeners of my podcast should be the ones inclined to run away screaming when this happens. But, it involves him as a young, a pretty young kid. So be warned. The older women still liked me, though. One of the ladies I would sit around with, I'll call her Ms. C because she's still alive, would ask me to have sex with her. She would say, boy, how big are you down there now? And I'd say, oh, I don't know. And she'd look and she'd say, oh, you're big enough. She'd say, come on over here. And then she would put it in herself and go screaming and hollering. Boy, you brought me, meaning she had gotten a thrill. She'd push me up. I had done nothing. She had done it all. She pushed me up. She just wanted me. There was a lady we used to have sex with called RMS. She used to be there in the school grounds at night, and the guys would run trains on her. 6, 7, 10 boys in a row. And he doesn't say what his age was at all. I didn't skip over anything, just FYI. My first homosexual experience was with a friend of my family's who the local gay people called Madam Oop. Madam Oop lived in our neighborhood. He worked on the railroad. He used to come to our house along with another gay guy called Sis Henry. That's S-I-S. My people had known them both for years. Well, when everybody was getting off work, Madam Oop would catch them, and he would use his mouth on them, and he would pay them. I didn't like it. I just stared at him. But I needed him because I would get money from him. Sis Henry, too. They would give me a little money. Sis Henry would follow the seasons. He'd go to Florida when it got too cold to work in Macon. He'd be on the street, and he'd talk to people in his high voice, say, how you doing, Miss Georgia? I'm doing so fine. My mom and dad didn't know I was associating with people like that. They never knew that we were doing these things. They would not have approved. Madame Oop would French you. He'd suck you and tell you that he had a vagina. And if you'd be nice, he'd let you get some of it. An older man telling you that, and you're a young guy. You see, he'd been with so many men. We're getting graphic here, folks. His rectum had been torn out and was no use anymore, so they'd put a colostomy in his side, and he used his rectum as a vagina. He talks some more about being, chased by boys and called homophobic names and slurs, and he says, they didn't like my action. See, the girls loved you, but the boys hated you. Got so bad I was afraid to be around guys. Sometimes white men would pick me up in their car and take me to the woods and try to get me to suck them. A whole lot of black people have had to do that. It happened to me and my friend Hester. I ran off into the woods. My friend, he did it. It was sickening to me. I was scared. Right, because if you're, a gay white guy and you don't want anyone in your community to know about that, you go into an impoverished community with marginalized people and you just drag some young black kid out into the woods. Because he's not going to come back to your neighborhood and tell anybody anything, is he?
Show starts in 8 minutes. Yum, yum. It's time for a tasty and refreshing snack.
All right, now let's talk about the film. The 2000 television movie, Little Richard, directed by Robert Townshend, starring Leon as Little Richard. Now, Leon is not a name I was familiar with, but I'm certainly familiar with plenty of the things he's acted in. He has been working steadily for a long time, since the 80s, in television and in films. Clearly valued highly for his performing abilities, his musical abilities. There's a lot going on, and also, probably a pretty athletic person too. He was in Above the Rim, back in 1994. That jumped out at me right away. Before that, there was a lot of TV, but then there was the movie Colors in 1988, which was a movie that kind of helped, among other things, Ice-T get famous. Then he was the main, he was basically the main character in Madonna's Like a Prayer video. He is the weeping statue. He is the innocent man that gets, framed and thrown in jail. Then he was, on some LA Law. He did a picture called The Five Heartbeats. He was in Cool Runnings. There's a ton of stuff besides all these. I'm just getting the most noticeable things that I recognize. Waiting to Exhale. Then we get into the late 90s, and he's in the Temptations TV miniseries. He's in the Alan Freed story, Mr. Rock and Roll, playing Jackie Wilson in a TV movie. Then the Little Richard piece. And then he's Brother Joe in Ali with Will Smith. A lot of other TV like Oz and Crossing Jordan. Then he's in Get Rich or Die Tryin', the 50 Cent biopic. Or biopic. More stuff. I mean, it's just he's doing at least 2 projects a year, it looks like. Yeah, the guy works, and he's talented. And hope you all enjoy the sound of my neighbor's dog barking outside just a second ago. It's warm weather. I got one window open. I assume you could deal with that interference. Now, the movie's written by 2 people, Daniel Taplitz and Bill Kirby. Daniel Taplitz has worked on not a ton of stuff. His credits start in 87, and they sort of finish up in 2016. Not much here that I am familiar with. You can check it out. Stuff like a TV movie called Black Magic in 92, a movie called Commandments in 97, Breaking All the Rules in 2004, Chaos Theory in 2007, something called Red Dog in 2011, and then Red Dog True Blue in 2016. Looks like fun dog movie for kids or young adults. I don't know. Bill Kirby wrote The Rose, which we've covered here on History of Rock and Roll and Film and Rock and Roll for the Janis Joplin episode, part 1. And he also worked on Hatfields and McCoys back in 2012, a TV miniseries that was on the History Channel that I enjoyed, I gotta say. He's been active since 1973. He even worked on an Alfred Hitchcock TV series for one episode in 85. Something called Shake, Rattle, and Roll, An American Love Story was the TV movie he made right before this TV movie. And it looks like high school friends start a rock band in the 1950s. Oh my gosh, I think I saw this. I think it was being promoted by, I want to say it was kind of tied in with Fender guitars, and that's why I knew about it. Interesting. Because it looks like, because he's, you know, guy is the main character's a band leader, and he's got his girl with him, Kathy Baker or Bonnie Somerville. She looks like Amy Poehler. But anyways, not too much to go into there. Maggie Gyllenhaal was in this. Right on. And James Coburn, badass. Apparently there was another Shake, Rattle, and Roll movie that came out in 1984. It's a Filipino horror anthology in 3 parts. What? Oh, come on. Yes, I have to find this. Anyways, it was directed, the Little Richard movie, by none other than Robert Townshend, who's been around quite a while and been very successful for things, you know, like, I mean, he directed Hollywood Shuffle back in 87, which is a sort of one of those sketch comedy movies of the 80s, similar to Kentucky Fried Movie or Amazon Women on the Moon kind of a thing, but it's, you know, it's all black actors and comedy writers and stuff. A lot of the stuff that would sort of, I think, inform and morph into stuff like In Living Color in the early 90s. He's done some Bill Cosby specials. He's done stuff like a Kaleidoscope, a TV a miniseries that's out now, I guess. Miss Pat, The Wonder Years, the new version, Black Lightning, American Soul TV show that was on in 2019. Anyways, he's been at it, and he's been doing good work for quite a while. You've seen, you know, if you think of like the Meteor Man, the poster of that's him. He was the director for that, but he also started it and wrote it. Anyhow, that's kind of the crew of the show. I have to say, I watched the movie in 2 parts. First part, I was a little more critical. Then I took notes while watching it, and I'll read those notes out of context. If you want to watch the movie, the notes will make more sense. But it was just observations as the show was happening. It is very much a TV movie. It feels like a TV movie. But then I put it down for the better part of at least a year, and then came back to it yesterday and watched the second half. And I have to say, I was so much more impressed. Once things start really ramping up in Little Richard's career in the story, it is just slam, bang, boom, boom, boom. Great set piece after great set piece. And the performances are fantastic. Everyone's acting in this whole picture is great. There are, however, a couple of moments where the presentation of a scene is very over the top to my eyes and ears today in 2023. It's very over the top, made for TV movie drama in a less than believable or relatable way to me. But I'm a very critical person, and things don't tug at my heartstrings the way they tug at the heartstrings of other people that would just be watching a primetime. I think it was supposed to be an ABC, movie of the week kind of a thing. At least those were the notes I read early on. But then at the end of the film, it's a Fox television movie production or something like that. And I should read some of the other actors that are in it too, because this it didn't end with acting credits. It ended with all the other production credits, and then it was over. So it was kind of weird. The cast includes Leon as Little Richard Penniman, Jennifer Lewis as Richard's mother, Leva May, or she's listed in the movie credits, Ma Penniman, as in M-U-H, Carl Lumley as Richard's stern father, Charles Bud Penniman, Tamala Jones as Richard's girlfriend, Lucille. And actually, another note I have for myself here says, actually Audrey Robinson, so maybe one of them was what she changed her stage name into, whatever. Garrett Morris as Richard's preacher, Carl Rainey, and Mel Jackson as legendary producer Robert Bumps Blackwell. I, again, enjoyed everyone's performance in this, especially Leon. Holy smokes. He has all the Little Richard charm and portrays it in a very human way that you just couldn't resist wanting to be around this person, unless you were put off by, the way he dresses and his sort of outrageous nature, if that was offensive to you because of its homosexual implications. I can see maybe not being charmed by this person, but I, just as a regular human being, watching the scenes, I'm just like, yeah. I think this guy, because he doesn't come across as just like a wild man for the sake of being a wild man. He doesn't come across as someone who's just bullshitting people. He seems very knowledgeable. When people are introduced to him, like Art Roop at Specialty Records, he knows the history of Specialty Records, and he oh yes, I know who you are. You've done this and you've done this and you've had hit singles with these people, blah 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 blah. He's sharp and he's on it and he's done his homework and he has worked hard at. Well, he's not just some weird flash in the pan crazy sensation that's shocking for the sake of being shocking. There was a lot behind it. Now, again, there's just so many good stories about Little Richard's development as a young person and a performer in his biography that I think it's pointless for me to reinterpret some of it in my own words, because his character comes across, his personality comes across really strongly in the narrative. He still isn't clear about the timeline, which is the problem in the previous segment. I don't know how to place his first sort of sexual experiences in his age, timeline, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for us. But he talks about, becoming one of these kids that gets, driven to old folks' homes and different people's houses to sit on their steps and sing to them, sing spirituals and things. And they would sometimes get paid for this. And he says every fourth Sunday in August, they'd have a great camp meeting in Logtown, Georgia. All the churches were open. It was like a reunion. Willard would carry us, who's the guy that took them around to all these old folks' homes, to Forsyth, Perry, Cordell, small country towns around Macon, and then we'd make a little money. Precious Lord was one of their favorites, and Peas in the Valley. We had this old teacher, and my favorite thing was to make fun of her. So here's another element of his, performing personality coming out, developing. She had a mole on her neck that looked like a blackberry, and her voice would quiver as she led us in songs. Well, I'd imitate her and make my voice shake. Everybody would start laughing, and when she came down on me, I'd point at her and fall out of my chair onto the floor, laughing, "Oh, that blackberry! Oh, the blackberry!" After school, she would stop by at home and tell Mother, and Mother would get on to me, and I'd stop for a couple of days. I was terrible to the teachers. I could remember most of them. My first grade teacher, Ms. Jackson. Second grade, Mrs. Graham. Third grade, Ms. Mason. And my fourth grade teachers, Ms. Austin and Ms. Phelps. That's spelled M-I-Z, M-I-Z, Ms., not Miss, and not Mrs. When I was a child of third grade age, in the mid-1980s, we were taught there was Miss, M-S, Mrs., M-R-S, and Ms., which is a sort of non-denominational, I believe, if I remember correctly. I've never seen it used in modern writing since the 80s, though. It was just sort of a like, it might be a widow, it might be a single woman, but she's maybe older, so she doesn't want to go by Miss, I think, was sort of a catch-all. After Women's Lib, it sort of got installed there, and it didn't last very long. He says, I believe that all my teachers thought I was crazy. I believe they all really thought I was going nuts. I think they must have been a bit scared of me. I would sing and I would do things to make people laugh. I wouldn't be telling jokes, you know. But it would just come out that way. I didn't want to study. All I wanted to do was sing. I would do little bad things like tearing up the teacher's stocking, and they would whoop me. I never played hooky, though. I had the kind of father that would kill you if you did. He would have knocked my head off with a switch. He talks about hearing people singing all the time around town. The women would be outside in the back doing the washing, rubbing away on the rub boards. And somebody else sweeping the yard. And somebody else starts singing, well, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. And gradually people would pick it up till the whole of the street would be singing. Or, sometimes I feel like a motherless child a long way from home. Sorry, everybody. Everybody's singing. I used to go up and down the street. Some streets were paved, but our street was dirt. Just singing at the top of my voice. There'd be guitar players playing on the street. Old Slim, Willie Amos, and my cousin Buddy Penniman. I remember Bamalama. This feller had one eye who'd play the washboard with a thimble. He had a bell like the school teachers, and he'd sing, Abamalam, you shall be free, and in the morning you shall be free. See, there was so much poverty, so much prejudice in those days. I imagine people had to sing to feel their connection with God, to sing their trials away, sing their problems away, make their burdens easier and the load lighter. That's the beginning. That's where it started. He goes on to talk about church and wanting to be a preacher since he was a little boy, and the experience of seeing people talking in tongues and then imitating them as kids, which goes to show how, how worship practices get passed down and kids get indoctrinated, if I may use that somewhat aggressive word. If it offends you, I apologize, but it's how I see it. It just makes young kids accept things that are, they're easy for their young mind. You go along to get along as a kid. You're not going to start telling an entire congregation, you guys are faking it. This is BS. But also you're taken in. I'm assuming you're taken in by it, and it's an exciting thing. He says, we didn't know what we were saying. They just imitated these adults talking in tongues. Another thing I used to do when I was about 10 was go around saying I was a healer. I would go to people who were sick and I'd sing gospels and touch them. And a lot of them would swear they felt better. They gave me money sometimes. I mean, how addictive must that be for a young person who wants to be, who wants to perform? Fantastic. He gets a part-time job at Macon City Auditorium. He still doesn't say how old he is. He's selling Cokes to the crowd for when shows are being promoted. He gets to see all the best artists and the best bands on the touring circuit for free, basically, and get paid, actually. Cab Calloway, Hot Lips Page, Cootie Williams, Lucky Millinder, and his favorite singer, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who we, in this current day and age, are lucky enough to know about, thanks to old footage that's now on YouTube. But I'd never heard of, of this woman for years and years and years in my life until social media, thankfully, and a good friend of mine, Ryan Scott, who passed along some details about her. He hung around the theater while they were unloading the cars and setting up equipment. When I saw her come in, I started singing one of her songs. She had a hit record out at the time on Decca called Strange Things Happening Every Day. She used to travel with Lucky Millinder and his orchestra and play guitar while she sang. I sang another of her songs, Two Little Fish and Five Loaves of Bread. She came over and talked to me. She asked if I wanted to come up on stage that night and sing a song with her. During the show, in front of everyone, sorry, it just makes me happy. She invited me up to sing. Everybody applauded and cheered, and it was the best thing that had ever happened to me. Sister Rosetta gave me a handful of money after the show, about $35 or $40, and I've never had so much money in my life before. But I got a lot from Marion Williams, a great gospel singer who toured around then. She never went to college. She ain't never been to school because she was born to sing the gospel. She's the one I got the woo from. As far as Richard's professional career, the details of it and where he's at as a performer and as a recording artist, it's in the narrative of the book, page 31 is a good place to sort of check out where things are picking up, because RCA in January of 1952 has Richard in the studio at Radio WGST to cut 4 tracks. I brought it all on myself, thinking about my mother. Please have mercy on me, and ain't nothing happening. The book notes that is the only one that gives a hint of the excitement to come. So maybe that's worth checking out if you want to pause and go hit the old YouTubes. Obviously, I cannot play music here for copyright reasons. They don't really, take off as far as record sales. But Rich goes home to Macon after that and keeps playing these one-nighter shows with a group called the Percy Welch Orchestra. Unfortunately, it's 4 weeks after that his father is murdered. And this obviously factors heavily into Richard's life. It factors heavily in the film, sort of setting up it's sort of it's kind of the linchpin of the first act. He himself says, "Daddy knew the man who shot him. His name was Frank Tanner, and he came from a family with a bad reputation in Macon. Frank was shooting firecrackers into the coal stove that heated the room where his dad is working, I guess. Daddy told him to stop it, but he did it again, so Daddy told him to get out. Tanner and his friends were making a commotion outside the club. Daddy took his pistol and went on outside, and that's when it happened. Frank Tanner shot him. He was dead before they got him to the hospital. I was away with the band on the night of the shooting, and it was very late when I got home. A guy met me and told me, 'Your daddy's got hurt or something.' But when I got home, my daddy's raincoat was lying on the porch with blood on it. It was raining that night. I walked into the house, and my mama was sitting there crying. She said, 'Richard, your daddy's dead. No more daddy.' I thought, oh no, my whole body just fell out. It's just awful to see your mama crying like that. First thing I wanted to know was who killed him. My mother wouldn't tell me. She was afraid I'd go out and ellipses. My sister Peggy wanted to go after the guy with a shotgun. She was that mad. She was the one who would fight for us. She was a great fighter back in those times. We believed that someone had my daddy killed. They didn't keep Frank in jail, and we were too poor. We couldn't go to get no lawyer and fight it. We believed that the police didn't like him because, ellipses, that's all I can say. I just believe that somebody had him killed, that's all. All right, there's a lot there. That's how he feels. That's what he believes. I feel like the statute of limitations by 1984 is up enough that you could go into more detail if that's how you really feel. Like you're not going to be. It's not like there's going to be a pack of bounty hunters descending on Macon, Georgia, to find the remaining, next of kin of Frank Tanner. And take revenge on behalf of Little Richard, but whatever. Maybe he wants to be that important. Maybe he truly believes that it's that big of a deal if he said something. But if the cops back in 1952 were behind it, I feel like he could say it in 1984 and not fear any repercussions. But maybe I'm wrong. It says my daddy had never been behind me in my career until then. And he was just starting to come behind me. He was going to buy me a car that Monday to help me in my traveling. Mother took it very hard because she was pregnant at the time. It was hard, but as a mother does, she tried to hold the family together, and she did. I remember going back to Macon in 1962 or 63, and Frank Tanner coming to us and asking us to forgive him, and we did. The Tip-In Inn was just a little place, one room, like a cafe. It sold food and beer and things like that. It had a jukebox, and the kids would go and dance and have a lot of fun. A nice, clean place for the kids to go. Peggy happened to be there that night, laughing and talking with my dad and dancing and everything. My record was on the jukebox. My father would play it all the time. He loved it, and he was very proud of it. The text goes on to say Frank Tanner was indicted by a grand jury for the shooting on June 5th, 1952, so that's about a month after, maybe. Bibb County, Macon records show a district attorney dismissal of the case on October 28, 1952. Now, to help support his family, because he is 19 at this time, and his older brother is fighting in Korea in the Marines, he goes to work washing dishes at a Greyhound bus station. As we noted earlier, that second session he did for RCA wasn't bringing in any money. He talks about, how he could have sort of coasted a bit now if he wanted to. If he didn't want to go to work, he wouldn't have really had to, because he said people then would feed each other greens and bread and beans and rice. We helped each other, but we were really poor then. You're poor when you have to make a fire and you ain't got no wood. I've seen people pull wood off their houses to make a fire in the house. That's poor. And I was one of the people pulling wood off the house. But he starts that bit with, I didn't have to wash dishes, I could have eaten. So with Charles White not really doing much of a job here as the author to sort of fill that bit out, I'm left to wonder, does he mean he felt obligated to make money for the family even though he could have just been a lazy asshole? Because, his mom's pregnant. And then he goes on to say he's poor enough he would have had to yank wood off of the, the roof of the house or the side of the house to throw it in the fire to keep them warm. So I don't get how that all is supposed to come together. Then after this, there's this promoter in Macon called Clint Brantley. He had a supper club called the Two Spot. He books a lot of traveling acts there for his club and also bigger concerts in other venues like the Macon City Auditorium. He would use local talent as openers. Obviously, that's a common practice even to this day. A former bass player with a local band in the early 40s, he had become a substantial property owner in Macon with a reputation as an expert in maneuvering local politicians and city officials. So he's a guy that recognizes Richard's talent and starts taking an interest in him. And at this time, Richard had a manager previously, didn't have one anymore. He's finding work in Macon and the surrounding area on his own. Brantley tells him, get yourself a band, and there's plenty of work available. Essentially, I can do something with you. You put a band together. Take care of that for me, please, and I will get you bookings. I will get you paid. This is a great thing. There's bits in the film that I don't think I cover later in my commentary about him having the local band, playing regional shows, having a great bond with them, and then, kind of having to break the bad news to them when he gets a real serious recording contract that he has to play with Warren G. The studio musicians, one of whom is portrayed by Warren G. Regulators. Funny, I just watched Young Guns a couple days ago. If you don't know what that has to do with Warren G, you didn't grow up in the 90s. What can I say? All I can tell you is you can't be some geek off the street. You got to be handy with the steel, if you know what I mean. And that Warren G's solo album, after he worked a little with Dre and Snoop, actually was worth listening to. Good stuff. But the point is, he goes to the studio to cut his first real serious, hits. And he plays with these studio musicians that are very talented, very professional cats. And, he has the guilt of having left his hometown buddies behind after all the hard work that they put in to support him on stage and be part of the show. But when he does get to touring nationally, he scoops his boys up and he takes them on the road. And we'll talk some more about Little Richard and his band in a bit.
We promise to satisfy your hunger, your thirst, your sweet tooth. So visit our refreshment center now. Let's go! Show starts in 7 minutes.
Okay, so I told you I took notes on the movie. Here are my notes from observing the first half. Note this came out around the time of early 2000s biopics, music stuff. This was a big, booming thing, it seemed like, in cable TV, especially VH1, was doing pretty well with their like dramatizations of the lives of Def Leppard and Meatloaf and the Jacksons, things like that. And it seems like someone else was smart enough to kind of get involved here. I can only imagine, though, that this was meant to be a theatrical release at its inception, and it was probably shopped around quite a bit before it was then, booked, I guess, for a made-for-TV sort of production. I just feel that way because Little Richard would assume his life needs to be on the big screen after seeing, Great Balls of Fire and La Bamba and stuff like that, because he was having a cultural resurgence in the late 80s when those movies were coming out. Thanks to his autobiography, I've got to say. I wrote, meeting Lucille scene at 33 minutes, 59 seconds. That was very precise. Why not just put 34 minutes? Nice to see his charm on display. And then his performance on stage singing Money Honey is a fun way to show off how different he was from anyone else in town or on stage. Then a really sad scene when I know what's about to happen to Richard's father. We get a supernatural moment where Richard takes 4 imaginary bullets on stage when his father is killed. I'll have to look at the book for his account of this and the meeting of Lucille. Of course, he's outraged at what's happened to his dad, and he expects, police to do something. There's a quote in the dialogue: 2 Negroes get in a fight and one killed the other. It ain't much of a crime. After Richard, urgently wants to know if this man's going to get the electric chair. I wrote, man, there's some psychotic shit that people do when they're boosted up on corn liquor. I'm not a doctor, but it does seem to me that people that sit around, drinking good scotch don't go out in the streets and fly off the handle and murder strangers. I think there's something bad that happens to your brain when it's, and this isn't about the character of the person. I'm saying the chemical content of the booze, malt liquors and what do they call them? Those those spirits of fortified wines, corn liquor, obviously, like moonshine stuff. There's something about what they do to a human brain that is just a little more sudden and extreme, it seems to me, than, some folks sitting around drinking wine and falling over. But alcohol is not a good thing. It's not a net positive in the universe as far as I'm concerned. But I do know that, when we talked about when it comes to the history of the American West, we would, when I was young, be taught about how, Indians couldn't handle their liquor. They weren't used to it. A white man brought it to them, and they're, chemically and culturally, they weren't really prepared for what it was about to do to them. And then decades later, I do more reading and I find out, the United States government made it illegal to sell alcohol to Native Americans at one point. And the bootleggers and fur trappers and traders and stuff, I mean, they're not bootleggers. They are, but not in the sense of the 20th century. Sorry, stumbling on myself. But the people that provided them illegally with what was known as whiskey, it was not really whiskey. It was grain alcohol that had been changed color with tobacco spit and flavored with like red pepper flakes and stuff to feel and look more like what whiskey was supposed to be. Like, they sold the natives just this evil, cheap stuff. All that is to say, it's my anecdotal experience and my opinion that a lot of good people do a lot of bad things when there's really horrible liquor in them that doesn't get processed the same way certain other kinds would when there's, a lower alcohol content. Anyways, I wrote, all these events portrayed very, very melodramatically with TV production values, hard to take seriously. It's very on the nose. Some parts remind me of a 30 Rock cutaway, if you are familiar with that show. If you're not, sorry about this reference, it's going to not be helpful. Where Jenna Maroney or Tracy Jordan are on the set of another show or movie saying something pedantic, very overdramatically while music swells. Because I think there's the scene of him swearing revenge, to take down his father's killer. Like, I swear I'm going to get revenge for you. I'm going to avenge your death. I'm going to find the man that killed my daddy. I think those were his words. I'm going to get the man that killed my daddy. And it's like music swelling and close up on his face and his determination. And it's one of those things that it could be a better show, don't tell kind of a thing. I mean, for most characters, I think it would be enough to watch him like get up and walk determinedly out the door and then cut to a scene where he arrives at the bar to find the man that killed his dad, or at the police station to confront the man, or to talk to the cops, or whatever the hell it is. But I guess because it's TV, it's like one of those moments where he looks directly in the camera before a commercial break or something, and swears on his life that he's never going to rest until this happens, which is relevant to the end of the movie when it comes full circle. Another thing that took me out of it towards the end of the movie is there's a montage. There's a breakup scene with Richard and Lucille, and there's a montage of every moment, every big, huge character moment that they had together in the film that happened over the course of the previous hour and 20 minutes. And I was like, yeah, I've been here watching that. What is it? What are you doing this for? Why are you doing this to me? Why are you not rewarding me by moving on? Because I already paid attention, and I thought, no, this was broadcast on television. Like, there's a lot of people that could have been flipping channels and come in halfway through the film. And, they're not like me watching it for free on YouTube and without commercials. So I guess that's just a thing that you have to do to recap for members of the audience that weren't there from the beginning. Fair enough. Whatever. Then I wrote, holy shit, Garrett Morris. The Reverend at his dad's funeral. Good stuff. Richard then starts singing and brings everyone to tears, of course, straight into auditions for his band. Tells them they're the Upsetters because he upsets people and it was called the Upsetter or something. And it's all so corny and staged and weird because they're like, yay! They then have hair straightening treatment with Lie via Lucille. Maybe read from Malcolm X's biography by Alex Haley about this. And I think I will. Okay, so I said I would have a little divergence into the autobiography of Malcolm X by Alex Haley, as told to Alex Haley, as it is labeled. I think this is relevant to the Little Richard story in more than one way. Passage I'm going to read, of course, occurs, I would say, at least 10 years, maybe 20 years before the era of Little Richard. As a young performer. This is the Zoot Suit era. And I'm going to cover a few pages here that I think the storytelling is good and the context is helpful to see where sort of race relations in America and American popular culture when it came to music and dancing was in the generation before Little Richard. He talks about... He struck up a little shoeshine stand conversation with Count Basie's great blues singer, Jimmy Rushing. He's the one famous for Sent for You Yesterday, Here You Come Today, and things like that. Rushing's feet, I remember, were big and funny shaped, not long like most big feet, but they were round and roly-poly like Rushing. Anyway, he even introduced me to some of the other Basie cats, like Lester Young, Harry Edison, Buddy Tate, Don Bias, Dickie Wells, and Buck Clayton. They'd walk in the restroom later by themselves. Hi, Red, because that's Malcolm's nickname. Which is funny to me, thinking about how in Shawshank Redemption, the book, the short story, Red was an Irish guy. And then, the casting for the movie, he was Morgan Freeman, and they still kept the name Red, even though he's a black guy without red hair. Anyhow, they'd be up there in my chair, and my shine rag was popping to the beat of all their records spinning in my head. Musicians never have had anywhere a greater Shoeshine Boy fan than I was. I would write to Wilfred and Hilda and Filbert and Reginald back in Lansing trying to describe it. I never got any decent tips until the middle of the Negro dances, which is when the dancers started feeling good and getting generous. After the white dances, when I helped to clean out the ballroom, we would throw out perhaps a dozen empty liquor bottles. But after the Negro dances, we would have to throw out cartons full of empty fifth bottles. Not rot gut either, but the best brands, and especially scotch. During lulls up there in the men's room, sometimes I'd get in 5 minutes of watching the dancing. The white people danced as though somebody had trained them. Left, 1, 2, right, 3, 4. The same steps and patterns over and over, as though somebody had wound them up. But those Negroes, nobody in the world could have choreographed the way they did whatever they felt. Just grabbing partners, even the white chicks who came into Negro dances. And my black brethren today may hate me for saying it, but a lot of black girls nearly got run over by some of those Negro males scrambling to get at those white women. You would have thought God had lowered some of his angels. Times have sure changed. If it happened today, those same black girls would go after those Negro men and the white women too. Anyway, some couples were so abandoned, flinging high and wide, improvising steps and movements that you couldn't believe it. I could feel the beat in my bones, even though I had never danced. Showtime! People would start hollering about the last hour of the dance. Then a couple of dozen of the really wild couples would stay on the floor. The girls changing to low white sneakers. The band now would really be blasting, and all the other dancers would form a clapping, shouting circle to watch that wild competition as it began. Covering only a quarter or so of the ballroom floor, the band, the spectators, and the dancers would be making the Roseland ballroom feel like a big rocking ship. The spotlight would be turning pink, yellow, green, and blue, picking up the couples lindy hopping as if they'd gone mad. Wail, man, wail! People would be shouting at the band, and it would be wailing. Until first one and then another couple just ran out of strength and stumbled off toward the crowd, exhausted and soaked with sweat. Sometimes I would be down there, standing inside the door, jumping up and down in my gray jacket with the whisk broom in the pocket, and the manager would have to come and shout at me that I had customers upstairs. The first liquor I drank, my first cigarettes, even my first reefers, I can't specifically remember, but I know they were all mixed together with my first shooting craps, playing cards, and betting my $1 a day on the numbers. As I started hanging out at night with Shorty and his friends, Shorty's jokes about how country I had been made us all laugh. I still was country, I know now, but it all felt so great because I was accepted. All of us would be in somebody's place, usually one of the girls, and we'd be turning on, the reefers making everybody's head light, the whiskey aglow in our middles. Everybody understood that my head had to stay kinky a while longer to grow long enough for Shorty to conk it for me. This is where we're going. This is what I've been building up to. One of those nights, I remarked that I had saved about half enough to get a zoot. Save! Shorty couldn't believe it. Homeboy, you never heard of credit? He told me he'd call a neighborhood clothing store the first thing in the morning, and that I should be there early. A salesman, a young Jew, met me when I came in. You're Shorty's friend? I said I was. It amazed me, all of Shorty's contacts. The salesman wrote my name on a form, and the Roseland was where I worked, and Ella's address as where I lived. Shorty's name was put down as recommending me. Salesman said, Shorty's one of our best customers. I was measured, and the young salesman picked off the rack a zoot suit that was just wild. Sky blue pants, 30 inches in the knee, and angle narrowed down to 12 inches at the bottom, and a long coat that pinched my waist and flared out below my knees. As a gift, the salesman said, the store would give me a narrow leather belt with my initial L on it. And then he said I ought to also buy a hat, and I did, blue, with a feather in the 4-inch brim. Then the store gave me another present, a long, thick-lined, gold-plated chain that swung down lower than my coat hem. I was sold forever on credit. When I modeled the zoot for Ella, she took a long look and said, well, I guess it had to happen. I took 3 of those 25-cent sepia-toned while you wait pictures of myself. Posed the way hipsters wearing their zoots would. Cool it. Hat dangled, knees drawn close together, feet wide apart, index fingers jabbed toward the floor. The long coat and swinging chain and the Punjab pants were much more dramatic if you stood that way. One picture I autographed and airmailed to my brothers and sisters in Lansing to let them see how well I was doing. I gave another one to Ella and the third to Shorty, who was really moved. I could tell by the way he said, "Thanks, homeboy." It's part of our hip code not to show that kind of affection. Shorty soon decided that my hair was finally long enough to be conked. See, it's all part of the package. It's all part of the visual. It goes along with the zoot suit. He had promised to school me in how to beat the barbershop's $3 and $4 price by making up Congoline and then conking ourselves. I took the little list of ingredients that he had printed out for me and went to a grocery store where I got a can of Red Devil Lye, 2 eggs, and 2 medium-sized white potatoes. Then at a drugstore near the pool room, I asked for a large jar of Vaseline, a large bar of soap, a large tooth comb, and a fine-tooth comb, one of those rubber hoses with a metal spray head, a rubber apron, and a pair of gloves. "Going to lay on that first conk?" the drugstore man asked me. I proudly told him, grinning, "Right." Shorty paid $6 a week for a room in his cousin's shabby apartment. His cousin wasn't at home. "It's like the pad's mine. He spends so much time with his woman," Shorty said. "Now you watch me." He peeled the potatoes. I remember reading this back in 1999 for the first and only time so far until today. So 24 years ago I read this, and this blew me away. He peeled the potatoes and thin sliced them into a quart-sized mason fruit jar. Then he stirred them with a wooden spoon as he gradually poured in a little over half the can of lye. "Never use a metal spoon. The lye will turn it black," he told me. A jelly-like, starchy-looking glop resulted from the lye and potatoes, and Shorty broke in the 2 eggs, stirring real fast. His own conk and dark face bent down close. The congoline turned pale yellowish. "Feel the jar," Shorty said. I cut my hand against the outside and snatched it away. "Damn right it's hot. That's the lye," he said. "So you know it's going to burn when I comb it in. It burns bad. But the longer you can stand it, the straighter the hair." He made me sit down. I'm talking about this because you got to understand this is what someone like Little Richard would have had to go through as well all the time to keep his hair the way it was. He tied the string of the new rubber apron tightly around my neck. A rubber apron, not even a cloth one. And combed up my bush of hair. Then from the big Vaseline jar, he took a handful and massaged it hard, all through my hair and into the scalp. He also thickly Vaselined my neck, ears, and forehead. "When I get to washing out your head, you be sure to tell me anywhere you feel any little stinging," Shorty warned me, washing his hands. Then pulling on the rubber gloves and tying on his own rubber apron. You always got to remember that any congoline left in burns a sore into your head. Congoline just felt warm when Shorty started combing it in, but then my head caught fire. I gritted my teeth and tried to pull the sides of the kitchen table together. The comb felt as if it was raking my skin off. My eyes watered. My nose was running. I couldn't stand it any longer. I bolted to the wash basin. I was cursing Shorty with every name I could think of when he got the spray going and started soap lathering my head. He lathered and spray rinsed maybe 10 or 12 times, each time gradually closing the hot water faucet until the rinse was cold, and that helped some. "You feel any stinging spots?" "No," I managed to say, and my knees were trembling. "Sit back down then. I think we got it all out okay." The flame came back as Shorty, with a thick towel, started drying my head, rubbing hard. "Easy, man, easy," I kept shouting. "The first time's always worst. You get used to it better before long. You took it real good, homeboy. You got a good conk." When Shorty let me stand up and see the mirror, my hair hung down in limp, damp strings. My scalp still flamed, but not as badly. I could bear it. He draped the towel around my shoulders over my rubber apron and began again Vaselining my hair. I could feel him combing straight back, first the big comb, then the fine-toothed one. Then he was using a razor very delicately on the back of my neck, then finally shaping the sideburns. My first view in the mirror blotted out the hurting. I had seen some pretty conks, but when it's the first time on your own head, the transformation after a lifetime of kinks is staggering. The mirror reflected Shorty behind me. We were both grinning and sweating. And on top of my head was this thick, smooth sheen of shining red hair, real red, as straight as any white man's. How ridiculous I was, stupid enough to stand there simply lost in admiration of how my hair was now looking white, reflected in the mirror in Shorty's room. I vowed that I'd never again be without a conch, and I never was for many years. This was my first really big step toward self-degradation, when I endured all that pain, literally burning my flesh to have it look like a white man's hair. I had joined the multitude of Negro men and women in America who are brainwashed into believing that black people are inferior and white people superior, that they will even violate and mutilate their God-created bodies to try to look pretty by white standards. Look around today. In every small town and big city, from 2-bit catfish and soda pop joints into the integrated lobby of the Waldorf Astoria, and you'll see conchs on black men, and you'll see black women wearing these green and pink and purple and red platinum blonde wigs. They're all more ridiculous than a slapstick comedy. It makes you wonder if the Negro had simply lost his sense of identity, lost touch with himself. You'll see the conch worn by many, many so-called upper-class Negroes, and, as much as I hate to say it about them, on all too many Negro entertainers. One of the reasons I've especially admired some of them, like Lionel Hampton and Sidney Poitier, among others, is that they have kept their natural hair and fought to the top. I admire any Negro man who has never had himself conked, or who has had the sense to get rid of it, as I finally did. I don't know what kind of self-defacing conch is a greater shame, the one you'll find on the heads of black so-called middle class and upper class, who ought to know better, or the one you'll see on the heads of the poorest, most downtrodden, ignorant black men. And I mean the legal minimum wage ghetto-dwelling kind of Negro, as I was when I got my first one. It's generally among these poor folks that you'll see the black kerchief over a man's head like Aunt Jemima. He's trying to make his conch last longer, between trips to the barbershop. Only for special occasions is this kerchief-protected conch exposed, to show off how sharp and hip his owner is. The ironic thing is that I have never heard any woman, white or black, express any admiration for a conch. Of course, any white woman with a black man isn't thinking about his hair. But I don't see how on earth a black woman with any race pride could walk down the street with any black man wearing a conch, the emblem of his shame that he is black. To my own shame, when I say all of this, I am talking first of all about myself. Because you can't show me any Negro who ever conked more faithfully than I did. I'm speaking from personal experience when I say of any black man who conks today, or any white-wigged black woman, that if they gave the brains in their heads just half as much attention as they do their hair, they would be 1,000 times better off. Now, to some of you listeners, I'm sure all that seemed like a very lengthy and unnecessary digression. But I'm a history nerd. Culture is important. That's one person's opinion. Of course, those are his judgments on people in his own community. I do not claim any of them, obviously, for my own. And I'm not trying to push any of those opinions, but just to give the opinion of a very prominent, historical human being, laying out his experience and then how he then came to look down on people that did the same thing he did. Now, by the time a generation goes by and you're someone like Little Richard, I think there's just as much argument to make that, hey, I'm a performer and I want to make money and I want to be seen in front of all kinds of audiences. And also I like the way that hair looks, maybe. I don't know. Maybe there's some stuff from Richard that I'll find in the book. It's been well over a year, I think, and a half since I put all the bookmarks in the book that I've been reading from earlier in this very episode. So we'll see. And I apologize to listeners if somewhere in this episode I've already mentioned things that I'm now alluding to. These things get recorded out of order. Segments get done at the moments in which my passions dictate. I can only say that that bit resonated with me as a young person who was about 20, 21 years old, because I had been through, middle school and high school in the 1990s, and I just despised fashion. I just hated it. I just hated how brainwashed everyone was. Well, everyone, that's the teenager's thought process. Speaking in absolutes, but how acceptable it was for teenagers and young adults to have to spend so much money on a stupid t-shirt or a polo shirt that has, inflated 10 times the price of the actual materials and the shipping and distributing it, because, it looks just like it's the same material as you'd get on a souvenir shirt at the beach, for cheap, or, out of a bulk pack of, Hanes cotton spun t-shirts. in a warehouse sale or something like that. And of course, it continues. It says Supreme on it. So it's $500. You're an idiot. Whatever. I mean, and it's the same with hair trends. But having had obviously no connection historically or ethnically to the Malcolm X story, it was, I don't know, it was just one of those things that it was just like, it's nice to be able to read the words of someone else who sees through the bullshit, but also took part in the bullshit because they felt like they had to, and that was the cool thing. And just to have someone who's a great, a leader of people just come clean about like, hey, it can happen to anybody, this fiercely independent, loud, rebellious man. It's just like, yep, I fell for the same trends, the same stupid fashion that made us feel shame for being born the way we were. And again, I think I bring it up because I believe you remove that by like a generation, and it's just something that's been normal, for young people that grew up seeing it, and it's not as much of an offense, and it's not as much of a symbol of anything in particular except for looking sharp, which is the way they want to look because it's been, because those trendy people before them kind of normalized it. We could probably go around in circles about this. It's analogous to hippies not cutting their hair or shaving their beards or wearing deodorant or, wearing brasiers and such, except they didn't have the racial component to this process. Okay, back to Little Richard. Now, if I couldn't shoehorn in at least one quote from Nick Tosches in this Little Richard story, I would be remiss. I would be a failure at my own propaganda. If you have been listening to the Patreon episodes, you've heard a good amount of Tosches writing. If you listened to the Jerry Lee Lewis episodes, you have got some of that man's story from his point of view, or not point of view, but his account through his looking glass. And I knew there had to be something about Little Richard that Nick Tosches had written. He's one of my favorite writers of all time. And I know there has to be more than this, but I'm not seeing anything currently that I can search easily. I wasn't finding anything in the Nick Tosches Reader, which is a great collection of his work from various eras. But it turns out he did an article for Cream Magazine in reaction to the 1971 concert for Bangladesh. Because, it's, there's a lot going on in that article. And I'm not going to read it all to you, just the part that considers, or concerns Little Richard. And there's what I think is a typo in here, because he refers to Little Richard of the Heartbeats. And I don't know that Little Richard ever did any time as a member of the Heartbeats. They were from New Jersey, I think. And he was obviously from Georgia. So I'm going to take this as Little Richard or the Heartbeats. And this is like halfway through his article about the concert for Bangladesh in 1971. I mean, does rock and roll have anything to do with anything? Once it adopts pretensions of meaningfulness outside that of a self-contained expression, matrical and flashing, doesn't it become art or pop kitsch? If not, how come all the psychedelic dreck of the last 5 years, in retrospect, can't hold a candle in terms of cosmic epiphany or plain old life energy to Little Richard or the Heartbeats? Little Richard, via his pure white energy raunch and total oversimplification, had the power to make people say, fuck it, and turn their backs on their own control conditioning and just go out and debauch and catch a glimpse of the violent, drunken, loving, dancing universe. The Heartbeats sprayed more ahimsa and love I flow from their beans than 3 Woodstocks ever could. What I mean is that people like Jerry Lee Lewis, or the Cleftones, or Commander Cody and his Lost Planet Airmen, or Archie Shepp have very definitely changed more heads around for the far better than a truckload of George Harrison's asking people to kiss it up to God and make it all better ever could. Just one of those honking, one-note saxophone solos off of Here's Little Richard, the album, has more spiritual energy, vision, and Tao fuck than 5 All Things Must Pass could shake a tube of Manny Magic Cuticle Remover at. And if you want to hear any more from that guy about the prehistory of rock and roll, check out Unsung Heroes of Rock and Roll by Nick Tosches. It's a very inexpensive paperback book that chronicles the stories of many, many, many amazing artists that didn't get the shot that Elvis did and sort of made whatever mark they could before Elvis's rise to power. And by extension, obviously, the rise of Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Chuck Berry.
I met Little Richard once, and we talked about how to give the audience a good time. I said, get the band on the stage and you get the audience high. When they're as high, you get on the stage yourself, then you tick them higher till they can't get no higher. And when they can't get no higher, you get off that stage.
That was British comedy legend Rick Mayall, rest in peace. If you're not intimately familiar with his work, you may have heard of. If you're familiar with any UK comedy in the 80s, you might have heard of The Young Ones. You might have heard of Bad News. If you're American and you grew up in the 90s, you would have heard of him because he was the lead character in Drop Dead Fred. He's done a ton of comedy over the years and sadly passed away about, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. But I was watching a retrospective of his life on the internet and clipped that probably a year ago, and it's been sitting on my hard drive waiting for this episode so I can throw it in there. A little words of wisdom about, getting the audience high and then getting the hell out of sight before they start coming down. Very smart man, Little Richard. Now, a lot of episodes of A History of Rock and Roll and Film and Rock and Roll, I try to do as little reading directly from the page as possible, but I can't help myself at various times. And this Little Richard episode is heavy on me narrating directly from someone else's page. And I hope that it's been enjoyable because I'm about to do it again. I appreciate you being here this whole time and listening to things that I have found and want to share with other people, like cool rocks that you find at the beach when you're 6 years old and you take home and then you bring to school. These are my cool rocks. Or a cool walking stick you find out in the woods, and it's a sword and a walking stick and maybe a rifle. It definitely has magic powers. All these words I find have magic powers. And there's a good chunk of this little book called Rock and Roll: An Unruly History by Robert Palmer. No, not that Robert Palmer. In the chapter titled Hoodlums from Hell, there's a section titled 100% Men. And I don't know if that's 100% men or 100% men. But let's read, shall we? All the payola in the world. Look up the word payola if you're not currently familiar with it. Couldn't seem to persuade Alan Freed to play a record he didn't like, and the records he liked were usually by black artists. Even during the early 50s, when it seemed every R&B smash inspired a sanitized white pop remake, Freed played only the black originals. One stray thought about the movie, the Little Richard movie from 2000 that I'm covering here, that I don't think I mentioned, was this great montage of Little Richard recording his hit songs and then the reactive cut to an actor portraying Mr. Pat Boone doing his versions of them, his covers of them for for the white audience, because the radio play was segregated at the time for the most part across America. It's very funny. It's very cute. It's played very earnestly by both actors, and I think it's a nice bit of montage for a made-for-television film in the year 2000. It's very cute that, like, Little Richard is like, oh yeah, let's make this as hard as possible on Pat Boone if he's going to have hits off of my writing. Let's make this very difficult. Let's play it faster. Let's do it at a speed and using language that he's not going to be able to get away with. And then they cut to him like sweating and singing the lyrics as fast as, Tutti Frutti, oh Rudy, a Tutti Frutti, oh Rudy, woo, Tutti Frutti. Anyhow, back to Alan Freed. When white rockers with something of their own to say came riding in on Elvis Presley's blue suede coattails, Freed's package shows continued to feature overwhelmingly black lineups. At Freed's concerts, black and white teenagers mixed and mingled as freely as the authorities would allow, I assume. Different levels of mixing in different states and different counties. But then again, I don't have off the top of my head a knowledge of how far into the Deep South the Alan Freed concerts went. The girls greeted favorite performers with screams and squeals. Often the girls were white, and the performers were black mojo men strutting their stuff. Early rock and roll shows and tours like Freed's brought instant integration and raised the specter of the white man's worst nightmare. Miscegenation. I'm sorry, folks. I never made it past community college. Miscegenation. Basically, that was the real fear. A black man fondling daddy's little white girl. And like most deep, dark fears, this one had some basis in fact. I'd made love to nearly 1,000 women over the past few years, women of every color, religion, and nationality, writes Charles Connor, the drummer with the Upsetters. Of his days on the road with Little Richard, we partied more than any band in history. They could afford it. Richard kept the party going by dipping into bags of cash, with which most groups were paid in those days. Bobby Bird, one of James Brown's famous Flames, recalls approaching Richard for a loan when Brown opened for him in New Jersey. Brown and his men hadn't made enough money from the show to get back home to Macon, Georgia. He, Richard, opened the trunk of his car, says Bird, reached in and scooped out a handful of dollars without even looking. The trunk of the car was full of loose notes and of all denominations. Among their fellow performers, Richard and his Upsetters were as notorious for their after-show bacchanals as for incendiary musical performances. Etta James, still a teenager when her "Roll with Me Henry" hit the R&B charts, had heard the stories. When she was booked on a tour headlined by Richard, she was determined to see for herself. She heard loud voices and much merriment from behind the locked door of Richard's dressing room, but several older performers took it upon themselves to protect her. This only piqued James' curiosity, and one night she hauled a chair out into the theater hallway, braced it against Richard's dressing room door, stood on tiptoe, and peered in through the transom. And honey, she says, her eyes widening as the memory hits her, the things I saw. What did Etta see? Charles Connor describes a typical scene. The kitchen was closed on concert nights, and when women poured in the back after the shows, we had our pick. We'd make love to chicks all over that kitchen. They'd be sitting around on bar stools waiting for us, some of them almost naked. 100 more would be screaming outside the door wanting to get in. 100? I don't know. Whatever. It's whatever it is, it's great. Sometimes Little Richard would have his boyfriends with him, or he'd sit on a table and watch us. More about his voyeuristic ways coming in, I think, the next episode that I put out. It had been part of our success and a way of letting off steam after we brought down the house all over America and in Japan, in the Philippines, and Australia. People just seemed to lose all control when Richard performed. They got a natural high from seeing sweat flying off him and his long hair flying all over his face. Thousands of women took their panties and threw them at us. We'd be playing and dodging panties. Sometimes they'd land on one of my cymbals. I picked him up with a drumstick and wave him in the air, and that would just make the women crazier. A dozen more panties would come flying at us. Richard, of course, was an outsider's outsider. Black and bisexual, and proud of it. The self-designated king and queen of rock and roll. Had he belonged to an earlier generation of performers, he would have had to keep his sexual predilections well hidden under a veneer of highly stylized masculinity, and doubtless subordinate his natural exuberance to a smoother crooning style. But Little Richard was a rocker, and this is one way you can tell. Rockers don't sublimate their idiosyncrasies, they exaggerate them, revel in them. We decided that my image should be crazy and way out, he writes in his sizzling autobiography, so that the adults would think I was harmless. Whether this was closer to image making or typecasting is debatable. In any event, Richard and his musicians decided that what was good for the goose would be good for the ganders. Richard wanted us to look like no other band had that we'd seen before, says Connor. So we started dressing in bright red or yellow shirts and white or navy blue trousers, and we got our hair gassed and curled like Richard's. At shows, we'd wear pancake makeup and earrings. He intended his band to look gay and act like sissies. First of all, it set us apart from other bands, but it also had practical benefits. If one of us saw a beautiful lady in the audience, he'd say in a little friendly voice, "I want to see you backstage at intermission." If she had any boyfriends around, they'd figure, well, he's a sissy. I don't have to worry about him. Then once we get these girls alone, we'd be 100% men. Okay, there we go. That's how we know how to pronounce the title of the section. The Upsetters may have been the first rock and roll musicians to discover the girls actually liked performers who dressed in gender-bending frills and finery, but were 100% men underneath. Rockers as musically disparate as the Rolling Stones, Alice Cooper, David Bowie, Prince, Boy George, and cross-dressing alternative icons such as Nirvana's Kurt Cobain and the Leaving Trains Falling, James Morland would keep glam current from the 60s to the 90s. Looking back, it seems that Little Richard and his cohorts, including Rough and Ready tour manager Teddy Reeg and the supreme rabble-rouser Alan Freed, did more than invent and popularize a new music. They were pioneers of what we might call the rock and roll lifestyle. Musically, rock and roll was not so much a departure from tradition as an evolutionary synthesis. For a hypothetical and highly unlikely listener well-versed in the history of jazz, gospel, hillbilly, western swing, Latin music, blues, and R&B, 50s rock would have held few surprises. And this wasn't the first time social problems, such as juvenile delinquency, had been linked to popular music. In the 1920s, jazz was blamed for the drinking and promiscuity of the flappers. The association of leather jackets, sideburns, motorcycles, and a delinquency with bop and R&B was in the grand tradition. Got fuck shit. Oh, God. Flipping a couple of pages, there's glossy photos in the all right of the Hollywood myth-making. Leather-clad Marlon Brando and his pack of cyclists in The Wild One, 1950, provided nascent rockers with a look and an attitude. In 1955, James Dean embodied the rebel without a cause, and teen hoodlum Vic Morrow terrorized a teacher to a Bill Haley soundtrack in the Blackboard Jungle. Nor was there anything new in the spectacle of teenage concertgoers screaming, swooning, and jitterbugging in the aisles to music with a heavy, emphatic beat. Charismatic band leaders such as Benny Goodman and Gene Krupa and their stand-up vocalists, including young Frank Sinatra, were the pop stars, matinee idols of the late 30s and early 40s. And their teenage fans, Bobby Soxers, were an energetic and sometimes volatile bunch. All this was business as usual. It was not business as usual when Little Richard hit town, trailing a young retinue of varying races and varying sexual persuasions. It wasn't business as usual when Alan Freed presided with a kind of avuncular glee over a theater full of white girls who were investigating the mysteries of the orgasm, encouraged by black men given to advertising their lovemaking prowess in songs. This was what rock's powerful opponents would not tolerate. And as the 50s became the 60s, it seemed that what America's rich popular culture had given us, America's moral watchdogs, were taking away. Freed was out of the picture by 1960. Little Richard, perhaps sensing that the shit was about to hit the fan, was back in Bible school, The Elvis Presley who returned from the U.S. Army tour of duty was no longer the sneering, duck-tailed hillbilly cat decked out in Beale Street's gaudiest pimpwear. The new Elvis celebrated his return to civilian life by donning a tux and singing a television duet with Frank Sinatra? Apparently Elvis, or his management, was about to prove that he could be as malleable as any of the impeccably coiffed and manicured teen idols being manufactured to order by the corporate music business. Even Buddy Holly seemed ready to follow Elvis into the pop music mainstream, if his sessions with strings and the last demo recordings he made before his fatal plane crash are accurate barometers of his intentions.
Did you fail to dress up for tonight's show? No tie, an old shirt and slacks, a house dress? Well, don't give it a thought. We're glad you came as you are. We just want you to enjoy yourselves.
Onward with more of my notes about the Little Richard story, or Little Richard from 2000. Early on in the movie, I wrote, first thing I notice is the bassist is using the same Gibson EB3 that the Flamingos bassist plays in the movie Go, Johnny, Go. And that, I believe, is what I covered in my Chuck Berry episode number 1. More of those to come. Not sure if his bassist used that instrument on this Australian tour, but it's period accurate. Sort of a scene that takes place in Australia when Little Richard sees this comet overhead and gets really shaken up by it. Next thing I notice is the soft focus, as if to replicate films of this time, if they were in color, and also noticing that they were good about live sound. When Richard moves away from the mic, the sound goes with him. Another point! I also would say that there's later parts of the movie that I really did appreciate the fact that, unlike the film Great Balls of Fire, where Jerry Lee Lewis demanded to re-record vocal tracks for his old songs when they're being portrayed, as sung live or whatever, or if they're being portrayed as being played on a jukebox or on the radio, you can tell it is a much older Jerry Lee Lewis coming out of your speakers. It is not the original recording. Unlike that, there's a distinct difference between seeing Leon singing live and then scenes where it's clearly an original Little Richard single being played. And I think if it's Leon, the actor that was singing on those live parts, he did a great job with the voice. It is a lot closer than a lot of other rock biopics that I've seen. And great job for him, but I liked the fact that they included, period-specific recordings. Or if they didn't, they sure did enough work to fool my ass. That's all I care about. If you're going to lie to me, put some work into it. Let's see. When his band is yelling at him to get up and not give up the show and stuff, and I wrote the "You invented rock and roll" speech is a bit much, but maybe that's the kind of thing his friends would say. People in his entourage. More likely, it is for the benefit of the audience. That claim, "You invented rock and roll." I mean, if you listen to my other episodes and my Patreon episodes, that's not the kind of thing I want to fight about. I don't even want to fight about who the king of rock and roll is, because I think you can make it just as much of a claim for Chuck Berry. I mean, there's elements of rock and roll that Chuck Berry invented or crystallized that other people had done close to before him. Same with Little Richard. There's a lot of things about Little Richard that he got inspired to do by other people's examples, but he put it together in a way that was magical and more effective than other people. And you can say the same for Elvis. Just to leave it out there, if I had to choose a king of rock and roll, not the best, not the creator, but just a dumb label like the king of, I think Elvis is the king, because he had a huge long career of not doing rock and roll, and people still thought he was the king of rock and roll. He didn't do rock and roll for very long. He went into gospel and loungy, schmaltzy stuff, and then being an actor and singing show tunes in his movies. way more than rock and roll. He did rock and roll for only a few years and then moved beyond it. And people were still calling him the king of rock and roll. I don't respond well to Elvis's work like I respond to, Chuck Berry especially, and Little Richard and some of Jerry Lee. But I could still say, if we're just going to put this pop culture label of who's the king, I think there's a pretty good case to make for Elvis because of the sensationalism. Not that it's a good thing. But I say all that because it's Little Richard's concerted opinion that he's the king of rock and roll, and it's the people that show up in documentaries about him that love saying that. It's not Elvis, it's Little Richard. Fine, whatever, cool. More important than that, Little Richard is Little Richard, I say. Let's see, I wrote flashback scene of Richard getting caught with his mom's makeup and clothes on as a kid. His dad's flannel, God, they could never make those look right. It looks brand new from 1997. Maybe I'm wrong. Any flannel historians, call in now. I love the mom saying, if you whip this boy for everything he does wrong, you're going to kill him. Good wisdom, like Nice Guy Eddie in Reservoir Dogs. If you beat this prick hard enough, he'll tell you he started the goddamn Chicago fire. That don't necessarily make it fucking so. His dad's disappointment when Richard loses, that would be believable if he instead was smiling. Like, okay, that's lesson number one, but how did this man expect his kid to win? I apologize. I already forgot what the contest was that he lost at the beginning of the movie. I also love the church singing scene next to his dad. And his dad's discomfort when he does the high woo. In interviews, he'd say this was when he found his real voice, and it made people happy, which he also loved. He would say, it made my big toe shoot up in my boot, which is actually a quote that he uses later in the film. It's a bit heartwarming to hear his dad say that he could be a good preacher, even with the devil in him. His confession scene could have been framed a little more effectively, but he gets his answer from the piano. Cute stuff. And then he starts boogie-woogie action right away with no effort. Garrett Morris is cool as the minister shouting about Richard bringing the devil into the Lord's house. This was seriously believed. The "he's no son of mine and he'll never be anything" scene, like right there with the door open, yelling loud for everyone to hear. I guess I had to make a note of that. Seemed a little unreasonable. Then the movie does a 4 years later thing. I dig him doing the echo trick with his head in a soup pot with no explanation for the audience. Like, I get it, because reverb. I love watching him do Caledonia by Louis Jordan. It gives some context to where rock and roll comes from. Again, you wouldn't know unless you knew. I got to look up Sugarfoot Sam, because they mentioned him. He gets an education with the Tidy Jolly Steppers and Sugarfoot, dancing, singing, being fancy, and bawdy. And for sometimes dressing in a wig and a cocktail dress. This was on NBC? Fucking good for them. 2000. By the time he finally gets back to Macon, Georgia, his family gets dressed up to see him, but his dad won't go. And then I have an aside where I say Little Richard and Jerry Lee are similar in their religious conviction, their internal conflict. They still have lots of pride and want to make tons of money, of course. They want to make their family proud and enrich their families and be the best there is. But, of course, they're sort of tortured because of their religious conviction. They feel like they are doing the devil's work, and they're trying to do it in a way that maybe won't destroy their chances at eternal paradise. There's a breakthrough moment in 1952 watching another singer-pianist named Billy Ray being super sexually provocative with the crowd while singing R&B with tons of vibrato on his voice, though deeper than Richard's. He clues him into the power of pancake foundation makeup to smooth out his complexion and make him look more like a movie star. He finds out Richard hasn't recorded anything ever. He becomes a mentor figure for this part of the movie, gives him a recording session to do By the Light of the Silvery Moon. I love the gear in the studio, and they actually show the acetate, the disc, being cut in real time with all the curly bits coming off. Very, 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 very cool. I also loved the recording session that happens later, after the first hour of the film, when they sort of dramatize the creation of Tutti Frutti. He's in the studio with a bunch of session musicians that are all, making fun of him behind his back for being a sissy and flamboyant and And they don't think he's very good. It's amazing. Warren G is in that part. He's like the leader of the studio musicians. He's the band leader. And it's amazing because he sings great compared to anyone, I think most of us have heard in close quarters in a casual way, that hadn't done much studio recording before. Like they sang a really bland song, that wasn't Richard's, in the hopes of getting a hit, and nobody's liking it. No one thinks he's a good singer. They say he can't sing at all. And it's just funny. Like their level of professionalism is shown to be so high that a young Little Richard just can't hack it. And then he starts, banging around on the piano in the lobby of the office or the recording studio, and starts singing his original lyrics to Tutti Frutti. And, it's decided that that's the song they're going to record as soon as they have their secretary rewrite the word. Their songwriter / secretary or whatever rewrite the filthy words to not be about butt sex. Another thing the movie does that you have to do, of course, in a film like this, as you did in, they did in La Bamba, they did it in, I want to say they did it in Great Balls of Fire, but maybe that was just buying a house for him and his wife. Not his mom. I don't know. They did it really well in American Gangster with Denzel Washington, who also played Malcolm X, of course. The buying a house for your mama scene. Yep. They go all out on this one for sure. It is wild, the house that he gets for his mom. Thing this movie doesn't do, I will say, probably to its credit because it doesn't need to, and maybe a credit to Little Richard's ego because he maybe didn't want this. There's none of that stuff that you see in like La Bamba or Walk the Line, the sort of like touring with other famous musicians kind of thing, like interactions with other, people on the same level. No one is shown to be on the same level as Little Richard in this film. There's the people that were there early on that inspired him, and then there's, more important stuff like going to shows on tour and dealing with segregation, having to go in the back way only, having to change on the tour bus, having to put on your makeup on the tour bus, not having access to facilities that white people do. And I think that's most of what I had to say about the film. Don't hold me to it. I might pop in later with a couple of things that I just remembered that I didn't write down. But overall, gotta say, it's a great example of how good a TV movie can be about a rock and roll pioneer and a great performer. And again, Leon just knocks it out of the park. He's so likable. Like, to me, growing up seeing Little Richard on like awards shows and stuff and Entertainment Tonight in the 80s, he always just seemed like a crabby, bitter guy that was like shouting about how important he is. Although he looked pretty cool for an older dude. He was like the guy that sang America the Beautiful at like WrestleMania one time, but that was taped, I guess. So, he was back in the public eye, unlike you didn't see much of that with like Jerry Lee Lewis. You didn't see much of that with a lot of other surviving folks from that era. So by comparison, Little Richard always seemed big and wild and loud whenever he would show up on something, and good, and it was cool. But again, compared to this portrayal of him back in the day when he was young and full of beans, as opposed to being old and full of beans, I can't stop being impressed at the portrayal and how charming the character is, and how, even inspiring the scenes of him and Lucille as a couple, and how flirtatious they are, and how well they know each other, and how much she tries to keep him grounded, not letting him get away with, putting anything over on her like he does everyone else. And she's the one there telling him, yeah, I know you're your own biggest fan, but can you focus up for a second? Like, it's great chemistry that they both have. Loved it. It made me happy. And I didn't sense or notice any of the usual tricks when it comes to portraying a performer on stage doing their thing in one of these movies. Very similar to the Beatles movie Backbeat that I reviewed a while back in the feed. If you haven't heard it yet, that maybe is now neck and neck with this movie as best portrayal of musicians being musicians on stage. Legit. Great stuff. No fakey cutaways to what is clearly someone else's hands playing piano that I noticed. I mean, they might be there, but they were at least well edited in. Nothing took me out. I guess that's the main thing I want to say. Nothing took me out of the story. Nothing after that first chunk was done, all the melodramatic TV movie stuff. When it came to the musical side of things, everything felt very immersive. I felt comfortable. I wasn't on edge, just waiting to be disappointed by something. They won me over. They had my confidence. They did it, and they portrayed things in a very, very captivating and convincing way. Loved it.
I'm putting it down, ain't I? I ain't hearing no amens, but I ain't wanting any. No. Hellfire. Hellfire. All right.
Want to make it. Do it.
There's somebody here.
Oh my goodness. There's so much to cover with Richard's recording career, even before he has any hits. And we've already talked a little bit about it. We got to talk about a couple of incidents that lead up to the recording of the old Tutti Frutti that as depicted in the film. And then on the next episode, I want to read from another person's perspective who knew Richard as his session drummer in New Orleans, and then a guy that went on to work for him in the future as well. But man, there's some stuff in here. I mean, I'm on page 35 of the autobiography for all we've covered so far. It's an amazing book. I'm gonna call out some stuff editing wise that I think is a bit goofy, but I can't help myself. He talks about how, we talked about, Clint Brantley. He's playing this place called the New Era Club in Nashville, next to the Bijou Theater. Stage was up in the bar. I was up there singing. And this friend of mine called Billy Brooks came in with Raymond and Mildred Taylor. His memory for names is amazing. His memory for all these things that happened in the early 1950s, 30 years later, fantastic. I think he's one of those dudes, and it doesn't have to be a dude, but I think he's one of those people that because maybe he didn't do a lot of drinking. Because he was so obsessed with sex. He's such a voyeur. There's so much going on in his sex life that his kinkiness, man. He likes seeing groups of people fucking. He likes bringing people together to fuck in front of him, and he likes getting a crowd together to watch somebody fuck. The guys like that. I mean, those are the Gene Simmonses of the world, man. They want to stay clean and in control. And more power to you all. Let's see. It's the level of detail we get into here. The level of detail, by the way, oh boy. I just got a message in a group chat from some very nice rock and roll friends of mine. And a good friend who knows me and knows the podcast a little bit is he shared this Instagram short from someone who does rock and roll trivia. And I've seen a couple of his short videos. He's a very smart guy. He's probably about my age. I think it looks like he's got one of those dudes that's got a collection of Les Pauls in his studio and very successful in everything he's doing, and has a groovy hat on and groovy glasses on and long hair. And he's there's a great story he had about Billy Idol, and then this one who is the rock star that thought the aliens from the movie Predator were chasing him across a golf course. And of course, if you've been listening, that was covered in one of the last, if not the last, Guns N' Roses episodes I just did. And I had to say, 3 seconds in, I know the answer because I just covered it on the podcast. And my poor friend was like, well, I just outed myself as a jerk who hasn't been paying attention to your recent episodes. And I was like, no way, man. I don't expect most people I know to need to listen to my voice more often than they already have to. But it also reminds me that, you know, the way to get successful doing stuff like this is to do it in like 1 minute snippets on TikTok with lots of hashtags. And I'm like a trolley conductor in Los Angeles in the 1940s, right before they just demolish everything and set fire to all the trolleys and build the freeways, build those cloverleaf interchanges and make room for automobiles, because it's going to be better for the economy, for the industrialists to make lots of cars and build those slabs of freeway across the entire United States. And I'm not lamenting that. I'm just saying I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you being a person who actually wanted to tune in to something like this and wanted something long form. There's a million long form podcasts out there that you could be listening to, and I assume you do as well as I do. I've got my share backed up in my saved feed on my podcast player for sure. And I just can't keep up. And if you are like me and you just can't keep up with all the stuff coming at you and you still make time for this, man, I just appreciate it. I appreciate you giving a damn about rock and roll, giving a damn about movies and how they're made, and giving a damn about creative people and listening to this right now instead of a 2-hour discussion about the latest episode of some reality show or a 2-hour discussion of some anti-science chicanery or something that just reinforces your own political beliefs and makes you feel empowered and happy without challenging you at all. And if you have other rock and roll podcasts or movie podcasts you would recommend to me, and if you have more suggestions for movies I should check out or good stories I should cover, email me at justtheworstever@gmail.com, please. There's no more Twitter feed from me. I had to shut that one down. I got too depressed being on Twitter the way it is today. And I'm also on Instagram at justtheworstever. Just the worst ever. And there's other links in the description of this if you want to support with a donation. I would love it. I would also love it if you just told a friend that you think might like the show about the show. And there's a Patreon, $3 a month. You get 4 extra hours of rock and roll history from various timelines. Definitely a lot of prehistory, pre-Little Richard, and, you know, post-Little Richard, some classic rock, some 90s stuff. I just did a bit about Skid Row in 1995, not their best year, as well as some of the origins of the RCA Victor Recording Company. So if that gives you any idea of what you might enjoy for $3 a month, there it is. So back to Little Richard. He says he was playing the Bijou Theater. Oh, no, the New Era Club next to the Bijou Theater. And let's see, he starts naming people. That's where I stopped last time. Barry Lee Gilmore, Jimmy Swan, a feller named Shorty. Raymond Taylor blowed trumpet and trombone, played piano and organ all at the same time. I say all this, I put this in here because I just want you to realize how competitive musicians were and how many skills they had, you know, in this environment, in this sort of market at the time. You know, his wife plays the drums. They had a 2-man band. They saw me up there singing and they liked me, so we got together. We formed a group, which we called the Tempo Toppers. So how amazing does Little Richard have to be the leader or the singer in a group like that? They go to New Orleans. They play a place called the Dewdrop Inn on Lesage and the Club Tijuana on Saratoga. He knows the names of the places still. He knows the streets they were on. Amazing. I love it. Audiences liked him there. And he talks about how Barry Lee Gilmore had an act where he would take a table or a chair in his mouth and leap up and down. He'd lift a chair with somebody sat on it. I really admired that, and I practiced doing it myself. He's in New Orleans for quite a while, and he meets a guy named Earl King, a singer, guitar player that had a big influence on Little Richard's style. He says there was also a woman named Patsy, or a female impersonator named Patsy, working at the Dewdrop Inn, who would sing a song called Hip Shakin' Mama. And he referred to himself as the toast of New Orleans, but Richard says he had a big old vaccination on his arm the size of a $50, and I thought he wasn't good looking at all. He didn't even shave off his mustache. So Richard is obviously a little more keen to use makeup to cover up scars and obviously put powder on his face and stuff. And he's starting to see these performers here aren't as savvy as him, I am assuming. He's like, I didn't like him. I wasn't attracted to him. He wasn't looking like a pretty woman. I didn't get on, I didn't have any relationships with him. I didn't know anybody who wanted Patsy. The narration then kind of cuts in italics and talks about the Tempo Toppers doing a lot of work for Clint Brantley, as we previously mentioned, who was getting them gigs. Often part of a blues package show throughout the Southland. Early in 1953, the Tempo Toppers will leave their residency at the Club Tijuana and move to the Club Matinee on Lyons Avenue in Houston, Texas. Johnny Otis, one of America's most outstanding musicians and arrangers, recalls his first night of Richard there. So the quote from Johnny Otis is, I had little Esther Phillips at the time, someone he had discovered. She had a lot of hits and was very popular. I was having lunch in the coffee shop at Club Matinee when somebody came out and said, Johnny, you just got to come and see this dude here. They were having a little entertainment. So I went through and I see this outrageous person, good looking, very effeminate, big pompadour. He started singing. He was so good. I loved it. He reminded me of Dinah Washington. He did a few things. Then he got on the floor. I think he even did a split, though I could be wrong about that. I remember it just being beautiful, bizarre, and exotic. And when he got through, he remarked, this is Little Richard, King of the Blues. And then he added, and the Queen, too. I knew I liked him then. He's just great. He was new to a lot of people around then, and they were saying, boy, that's something else. So they start developing a buzz, in the Houston area. They get the attention of a company called Peacock Records and their president, Don Roby. He goes to listen to the band. He signs them on his record label. On February 25th, 1953, they recorded 4 songs. Always, Ain't That Good News, Foot at the Wheel, and Rice, Red Beans, and Turnip Greens. And if that isn't a title that that doesn't make you want to, double negative. If that isn't a title that makes you want to go right now to your favorite streaming service and look it up and then maybe go, purchase it, I don't know what else to tell you. Rice, Red Beans, and Turnip Greens. I am sold. I want to get a tattoo of that. Without even hearing the song. Let's see. So they didn't, but unfortunately, none of those really took off. They didn't, sell a lot of records. Roby's got a reputation for being really, really, really aggressive and tough and overbearing. He was known as the Black Caesar. I know that's a film. Hang on. I mean, Little Caesar was a gangster movie. And then there was Black Caesar. What was the deal with Black Caesar? Information on Black Caesar, the film.
Here's the plot synopsis.
Oh, 73. Tommy Gibbs. Oh, I said it tough. Grandma's cheese. It looks like it is, it's a crime story. It's a mob, sort of a black mafia kind of thing. Okay, so it's not about a recording, a record label president or a recording studio patriarch, I guess. But he goes everywhere with like bodyguards that are packing pistols. And he rules with an iron fist. At this point, Richard is like 21 years old. He's very self-confident. He's a showman through and through. And, you know, he's kicking out a lot of bizarre energy to people that aren't really used to someone like him. He speaks his mind loudly at the top of his voice. And he is the opposite of the kind of compliant artists that Roby is used to dealing with, who are usually very grateful to him and make a point of telling him how grateful they are for any opportunity and any time that Roby sort of provides them. So these guys clash hard. Richard gets called into Peacock Records at the office for a dressing down about his attitude. And they get into it, and Roby loses his goddamn temper with Richard. Richard says, "He jumped on me, knocked me down, and kicked me in the stomach. It gave me a hernia that was painful for years. I had to have an operation. Right there in the office, he beat me up. Knocked me out in one round. Wasn't a second or third round. He just come around that desk and I was down." He was known for beating people up, though. He would beat everybody up, but Big Mama Thornton, he was scared of her. She was built like a pit bull. Don Roby was a disciplinary person, he says, almost like a dictator. And here's a part I don't know. I don't know what to tell you about this next statement. He was a black guy that looked like a white guy, and he was very stern. Maybe that means in the sort of suits he was wearing. I don't know. He looked like a white guy. Maybe he was light skinned as well. Haircut, mustache. I don't know. He wore great big diamonds on his hand, and he was always chewing this big cigar, cussing at me around the end of it. I never knew how he smoked it because he was chewing it all the time. He was so possessive. He would control the very breath you breathed. I resented him being so mean. He didn't want to give me any freedom. He had artists like Clarence Gatemouth Brown. You guitar players out there might know who that is. Bobby Bland. You singers out there might know who that is. And Johnny Ace. He controlled all of them. He had his own booking agency called Buffalo, run by a lady named Evelyn Johnson. God damn, he's got all the names. I refuse to let him control me. If I can't have freedom, I can't be happy. Contracts don't mean a thing to me if I can't be relaxed. A contract is only your word. Paper don't mean nothing to me. Well, that's how you probably got ripped off a lot. Richard. Well, I was telling people how rude he was and how nasty he was and how he didn't pay me. He was a crook and was just using all these people, using them up. I spoke out against him loudly, louder than I could today because I had more breath to do it with then. He was very angry with me about all this. Oh, God, Richard. Oh, you're killing me here. Jesus, it's so good. Okay, so on October 5th of that same year, Roby tries to team him up with Johnny Otis and his band to record 4 more songs, Directly From My Heart to You, I Love My Baby, Maybe I'm Right, and something called Little Richard's Boogie. The tracks were not even released at that time. So that kind of spells the end of the Tempo Toppers, and they all kind of go their separate ways. He keeps going on playing dates for Clint Brantley with a backup guitarist named Thomas Hartwell, who was from Memphis. But then, you know, after a whole year of working with this entire, you know, well-rehearsed band behind him, Richard kind of finds the whole solo thing unsatisfactory, and in that current form, he looks for a new kind of band. The text says he wanted more emphasis on a hard, driving R&B rather than the gospel-oriented sound of the Tempo Toppers. He comes across a drummer, Charles Chuck Connors, not the villain from the Spider-Man comic books, the Lizard, but Chuck's from New Orleans, and a piano player who also plays saxophone named Wilbert Lee Diamond Smith. They had been working at a club in Nashville with a male-female duo called Shirley and Lee. Now, this is where Clint Brantley really, really helps things out. He sets up a tour for the new version of Little Richard's band around Georgia, Tennessee, Nashville, Knoxville, Milledgeville, Sparta Fitzgerald, and Tallahassee. Richard talks about how well they drew big crowds everywhere they went. Places were packed. He was popular around those states before Chuck and Lee Diamond joined the band. He's like, I got 2 sax players and named the band the Upsetters. And it made me outstanding in Macon at the time to have this fantastic little band in a little town like this. So other bands in the area just can't compete with how, high energy and interesting and professional they are. And people want to show up and see what's going to happen when he comes to a club nearby you. He says they were making $15 a night, and there was a lot you could do with $15. We would play 3-4 nights a week. That's $50. And sometimes we would play a place on the outskirts of Macon at a midnight dance. So just packing in the action all night long. Damn. I mean, just you got to love playing and sweating and entertaining people. And also be able to keep up that appearance. I mean, literally keep up your appearance. Not keeping up appearances, but like redoing your hair, I assume, and your makeup and your sweaty clothes, changing into fresh threads before that midnight show. Maybe, I don't know. He said that midnight show would pay $10 and all the fried chicken you could eat. Oh my God! Can you imagine all the fried chicken you can eat after playing 3 sets, driving across town? And then playing a midnight set. So you're talking what? 1:30? It's like 1:30, 2 a.m. Maybe it's 3 a.m. I mean, if you're partying, I mean, you got to be eating while the kitchen's still cooking. So, I mean, just desperately piling on fried chicken at that end of the night because it's part of what you're getting paid. Like when you're young and you're just cramming beers down your throat or other beverages down your throat because the night's almost over. If you were that way inclined. See, I wasn't when I was young. I was that way inclined a little after that. Because I finally got past the point where I was mothering everybody and giving them water before they passed out. All of a sudden, that wasn't my job anymore. Hey, got the acid reflux these days, so don't do it. I don't do it anymore. That's so late at night. Let's see. Fried chicken. Oh, they were so the covers they were doing. Roy Brown, he says, a lot of Fats Domino, some B.B. King, and Little Walter, and a few things by Billy Wright. I really looked up to Billy Wright. So here's an editing thing that bugs me. He says, I really looked up to Billy Wright. That's where I got the hairstyle from and everything. Keep Your Hand on Your Heart song title. That was one of them. So if I was editing this book, like it's one thing if he's appearing on a television interview and you can see him talking and moving and gesticulating wildly, and you can get that he jumped from, I loved his songs, he gave me the idea for the hair. Keep Your Hand on Your Heart. That's one of them. No, grammatically, that means that's one of his hairstyles, not one of his song titles. But if it was an audio or video interview, you would get it. If it's in a book, could you please, for crying out loud, Charles White, before I lean into you, or is that's not the phrase. Before I lean on you, or something into you, or dig into you next time when we read. It's Earl Brown or Earl Thomas's quotes. I forget. I was reading them yesterday. I'm holding them off for the next episode about some things that supposedly Charles White did not cover very well in the right place in the right time. Foreshadowing. Anyways, we'd all play around Georgia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. We would draw packed houses at every place, and we get a guarantee and a percentage of the take over the guarantee. So that means, let's a pretend number, $200. Your band's making $200 just for playing here, no matter what happens. If you play the whole night that you're supposed to. Now, that's your guarantee. Percentage is if the bar and the house, from taking tickets or whatever, cover at the door, and then selling drinks, makes in excess of some amount. Let's say $500. I mean, I'm thinking, probably not in 1953 terms. Then you get a percentage of that. If your crowd is very, very spendy, then, a good house will give the artist a cut of how much extra over the top they make of a certain amount. He says, we're making a damn good living. One song which would really tear the house down was Tutti Frutti. The lyrics were kind of vulgar. Tutti Frutti, a good booty. If it don't fit, don't force it. It would crack the crowd up. I forget what it was in the movie. There's a line about greasing up somebody's butthole to get that thing in there. We were playing without a bass, and Chuck would have to bang really hard on his bass drum in order to get that bass fiddle effect. Macon was a good place to live if you were in the entertainment business. The years of the early 40s, when the military bases were in the area, they had, at this point, I guess, left the city with lots of nightclubs, big and small, like the Manhattan, the Elks Club, Club 15, Ann's TikTok Club, Man's Drive-In, Sawyer's Lake, many others. All of them had live entertainment. Within a couple of hours' drive from Macon was Atlanta and the border town of Columbus, Georgia, and Phoenix City, Alabama, which they used to call Little Las Vegas because gambling was legal there. So he talks about his reputation getting out in the South. People talking some trash about his name, saying he's terrible. And he talks about going to see Fats Domino in Macon whenever he would come, and Chuck Berry whenever he would come around. And they were both stars. But he notes they were both considered blues. And what Little Richard was doing, I think this is him sort of hinting at, hey, I'm not saying I was calling it rock and roll then, but what I was doing was not accepted by the blues community, or it was kind of looked down upon. I was, sort of an aberration of the music scene at the time. But his name's getting all over the place. He talks about Lloyd Price coming to Macon to play the auditorium. And he was a big star. He had a big hit with Lawdy Miss Claudy. Richard says he had a black and gold Cadillac. I wanted one just like that. There weren't that many Cadillacs about. The only place that had one was the funeral home, and you had to die to ride. As Nick Toshi said in the introduction to Unsung Heroes of Rock and Roll, which you can hear on the Patreon, blacks, whites, Jews of the era were all united because they all loved Cadillacs. As far as the rock and roll business goes, whether you were a white singer or a black singer or a Jewish record producer, or record label owner, everyone was out to get themselves a Cadillac. It united all American rock and roll entrepreneurs. He says he goes to talk to Lloyd Price, and he told me to send a tape to a guy called Art Roop at Specialty Records in Los Angeles. And this obviously, there's a meeting in the movie where this happens. It doesn't show him like sending him a tape or anything, but it shows him Art Roop showing up at a gig or showing up at a hotel or something, or in the recording studio. I forget. Call in if you remember. So I talked to Lloyd Price. I went to radio stations in Macon. One of them had the call letters WBML. I recorded some blues. That was in February 1955. One of the songs was Wonderin', which I'd stole from a friend of mine. He wrote it, and I had got it. I used to hear him singing it, so it just stayed in my mind, so I took the song. The other one on the tape was He's My Star. I sent it off to the address Lloyd had given me and just carried on playing with my band. Weeks and weeks went by, and I never heard from Specialty. Even when I called, I couldn't find out what was happening. Then I got into trouble with the law and had to stop appearing in Macon clubs. Get ready for this one, folks. It's going to get nasty again. I mean, not too nasty, but, it's going to get sexy.
Rock and roll music and why I preach against it, and I believe with all of my heart that it is a contributing factor to our juvenile delinquency of today.
So Richard knows a gal by the name of Fanny, and he would drive her around so he could watch other people have sex with her. She'd be in the back of the car, the lights on, her legs open, and no panties on. I'd take her around so the fellas could have sex with her. She didn't do it for money. She did it because I wanted her to do it. She wasn't very old. I used to enjoy seeing that. There's a lot not being said in between those sentences. All we know is she wasn't very old. Her name was Fanny. And she would do things and let people do things to her because Richard was getting off on it. Well, I got put in jail for it, he says. I went into the gas station. Again, this is a good time for the editor or the supposed, author, Charles White, to step in and say, excuse me, was this after somebody had sex with her? You drove to a gas station, or was this before you were going somewhere else? Or how many people had she had sex with that? When did you pick her up? What were you doing? What were you wearing? What was she wearing? Like, let's expand on this a little bit. I mean, am I a pervert for thinking this? I mean, I just feel like storytelling wise, maybe I've done too much audiobook narration for the romance novels. But I feel like this should be fleshed out a bit more, pun intended. So anyway, he says, I went into the gas station and the gas station man reported me to the police. They put me in jail. Lewd conduct, they called it. Well, it is lewd conduct. I mean, it's conduct that is lewd. I think you could have been, considering race relations at the time, you could have been jailed for something a lot more trumped up than that. Pun also intended. Central Park 5. They put me in jail. Lewd conduct, they called it. I wasn't in jail for more than a few days. I wasn't treated badly. That's nice. Then my mother got a lawyer by the name of Lawyer Jacob. He told the court, okay, there's, more racial slurs coming right now. He told the court, this nigger's going to get out of town. He ain't going to be here no more. So they let me go. I left Macon. I couldn't go back and play there no more because of that. We just stayed on the road. Man, don't shit where you eat. Don't take a dump in your own backyard. Well, that's whatever. Kinky stuff is kinky stuff, and when you got a fetish for it, you got a fetish for it, I guess. 10 months after he'd sent his tape off to Specialty Records, they get in touch with him. He's playing in Tennessee, a place called Fayetteville, and he gets a call early in the morning. So I assume whatever hotel or motel he's staying at, call from someone saying, meet us in New Orleans. Oh, I slipped away and left my band in the motel, except for Henry Nash, Lee Diamond, and Chuck Connors. How many people are in the band? Jesus Christ. We loaded up the car and drove right down into New Orleans. As we were crossing Lake Pontchartrain Bridge, it was raining so hard we couldn't see to drive. The wipers on my Chrysler were not working. Oh, God. So we took coat hangers and tied them to the blades and worked them by hand so that the driver could see the road. We didn't want to stop because we were afraid we would miss the session the next morning. And so I recorded Wonderin', He's My Star, directly from my heart to you, and I'm just a lonely guy. Because at that time, Specialty wanted me to be a blues singer, like B.B. King and Ray Charles. And then I did Tutti Frutti. Here we go. Here we get into it. Now, I am going to get into the backstory with Specialty Records and Bumps Blackwell on the next episode. Right now, how cute. There's a little sugar ant crawling through the pages of my book right now. They're all over me right now. It's August. It's August, and I've got a lot of ant bait in my cupboards to clean out these bastards. Because it was shown and depicted in the film. I want to read Bumps Blackwell's account of what that recording session was like. And then the next episode, we'll talk about other people's versions of, or maybe some counter argument to it or whatever. And let's see, he says the first session was to run 6 hours. The recording equipment was a little old 1/4-inch single-channel Ampex Model 300 in the next room. I would go in there and listen with earphones. If it didn't sound right, I'd just keep moving the mics around. I would have to set up all those things, but you see, once I got my sound, my room sound, well, then I would just start running my numbers straight down. It might take me 45 minutes, an hour to get that balance within the room, but once those guys hit a groove, you could go on all night. When we got it, we got it. I would like to see some of these great producers today produce on monaural or binaural equipment with the same atmosphere. Because the problem is, if you're going to get a room sound with the timbre of the instruments, you can't put them together as a band and just start playing. All of a sudden, one horn's going to stick out. So I had to place the mics very carefully and put the drummer outside the door. They had planned to cut 8 sides that day through a 6-hour session. Richard runs through the songs on his audition tape. He's my star. Bumps says it was very disappointing. I did not even record it. But Wonderin', we got in 2 takes. Then we got I'm Just a Lonely Guy, which is written by a local girl called Dorothy LaBostri, who was always pestering me to record her stuff. Then The Most I Can Offer, and then Baby. So far, so good. But it wasn't really what I was looking for. I had heard Richard's stage act was really wild, but in the studio that day, he was very inhibited. Possibly his ego was pushing him to show his spiritual feeling or something. But it certainly wasn't coming together like I'd expected and hoped. The problem was what he looked like and what he sounded like didn't come together. If you look like Tarzan and sound like Mickey Mouse, it just doesn't work out. And this is the thing that I think the film doesn't accurately portray at all. And you've heard me, kind of ramble about that earlier. But it just doesn't come off like he's a poor singer or he's a weak singer or he's not sounding like himself. It's just him singing songs that are kind of mellow as it's portrayed in the film, and not what you want from Little Richard. The problem was, let's see. Oh, sorry, I just said that. Jesus, you know what it's like when you don't know what to do? It's, let's take a break. Let's go to lunch. I had to think. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go back to Roop with the material I had because there was nothing there that I could put out. Nothing that I could ask anyone to put a promotion on. Nothing to merchandise. And I was paying out serious money. So here we go over to the Dewdrop Inn, and of course, Richard's like any other ham. We walk into the place, and the girls are there, and the boys are there, and he's got an audience. There's a piano, and that's his crutch. He's on stage reckoning to show Lee Allen his piano style. So, wow. He gets going. He hits the piano and starts to sing a wop baba luma, but good goddamn. Tutti frutti, a good booty. I said, wow, that's what I want from you, Richard. That's a hit. Now, in the movie, they just show this happening in another room in the studio. I knew that the lyrics were too lewd and suggestive to record. It never would have got played on the air. So I got a hold of Dorothy LaBostri, who had come over to see how the recording of her song was going. I brought her to the Dewdrop. Dorothy was a little colored girl so thin she looked like 6 o'clock. Damn it. That's great. She just had to close one eye and she looked like a needle. I read this. I had this bookmarked. And I swear to God, I have a memory of already recording this, and I don't know why. I have never done a Little Richard episode for the show. I don't think I've done it for the Patreon. It's weird, but the language in this is so fantastic. I feel like I might have read this to somebody before. I don't know. I might have just enjoyed it way too much the first time I read it and laughed out loud. That's just amazing. She'd been singing these songs to me, but the trouble was they all sounded like Dinah Washington's Blowtop Blues. So we had an earlier comment that, somebody reminds them of, or Otis, Johnny Otis thinks of Dinah Washington when he sees and hears Richard. And this woman that's going to rework the lyrics to Tutti Frutti reminds, bumps of Dinah Washington. They were all composed to the same melody, but looking through her words, I could see that she was a prolific writer. She just didn't understand melody. So I said to her, look, you come and write some lyrics to this, because I can't use the lyrics Richard's got. He had some terrible words in there. Well, Richard was embarrassed to sing the song, and she was not certain that she wanted to hear it. Time was running out, and I knew it could be a hit. I talked, using every argument I could think of. I asked him if he had a grudge against making money. I told her that she was over 21, had a house full of kids, and no husband, and needed the money. And finally, I convinced them. Richard turned to face the wall, and he sang the song 2 or 3 times, and Dorothy listened. Break time was over, and we went back to the studio, so we could finish the session, leaving Dorothy to write the words. I think the first thing we did was directly from my heart to you. Now that and I'm just a lonely guy could have made it. Those two I could have gotten by with, just by the skin of my teeth. 15 minutes before the session was to end, the chick comes in and puts these little trite lyrics in front of me. I put them in front of Richard. Richard says he ain't got no voice left. I said, Richard, you've got to sing it. There had been no chance to write an arrangement. So I had to take the chance on Richard playing the piano himself, meaning the session musicians weren't coached up on this tune, obviously. No one had heard it. That wild piano was essential to the success of the song. It was impossible for other piano players to learn it in the short time we had. I put a microphone between Richard and the piano and another inside the piano, and we started to record. It took 3 takes, and in 15 minutes we had it, tutti frutti. So the band's going to have to just sort of like watch him and play along. You know, they don't have charts to look at or arrangements or nothing. And yeah. And then at the end of the chapter, they print the lyrics to Tutti Frutti. From Penniman, Labostri, and Lubin, first specialty record. That bit about, you know, if it's there's a bit in the originals about like if it's not easy, make it greasy or something like that. And I just read yesterday that there was a Frank Zappa, or the Zappa and the Mothers of Invention album with liner notes that noted one of their songs as Little Richard likes this song, something to that effect. Which there's really no proof of that. There's nothing in the history books to say that Little Richard knew much about Frank Zappa or that song necessarily to corroborate that. But I think Frank liked Little Richard a lot because there is a song he did. I forget what era it is. I want to say it's in the solo era of the 80s, you know. Maybe it's Shake Your Booty. Maybe it's, I don't know. I don't know. I forget. It's Keep It Greasy so it'll go down easy. Maybe it was like post of the apostrophe overnight sensation era. I'm not quite sure. I could look it up right now, but you know, I'm on a roll. I've been recording. If you know it, call it in. Clearly, Frank knew the original lyrics to Tutti Frutti, is all I'm saying. Blow job, give me that blow. Different song, I know. All right. That's all the Little Richard for the moment. We have so much more to get into. It's going to be so much fun. Oh my goodness. Now, next Little Richard episode will cover The Girl Can't Help It. Not only one of my favorite Little Richard song titles, but probably my favorite of all the 1950s rock propaganda movies. If I may attach that label. I don't know what else to call the genre. I mean, they're rock and roll movies. Very well produced, very well directed. And the performances of the artists that were involved, fantastic. But I also got some Van Halen episodes to finish. I've got the Patreon, the second Patreon for this month to start working on before we get too deeper into August. And I got to get out and get some sunshine on my face, as Richard Pryor would recommend in his autobiography. Got to be nice to yourself when you can. I think you should keep doing things today that are good for you to do with your time, to be entertained. You absolutely deserve to be loved. You deserve to be able to do things that spark your creativity. And I thank you once again for being here with me through all of this. Now, the show has no ads. Show has no guests, for me to bounce off of and waste time with. Has no product placement of any kind and no support beyond the Patreon. So please consider that. And if not, how about throwing a good review up on whatever the format you're listening? it's YouTube, please click a like. Please click a subscribe. I'm trying to make some waves here. Trying to be seen in a sea of podcasts that have a lot of advantages over this one when it comes to the business and when it comes to the audience. Not bitching and moaning about it. I chose this path myself. I chose to do things in a way that don't lend themselves well to the kind of genre that attracts constant listeners. It's not focused on pop culture happenings. It's not focused on current events. It's not focused on the news. It's not focused on the culture war in America. So, attracting a steady audience for this is an uphill battle. I appreciate you being here and hopefully sharing it with someone else. Have I appreciated you enough today? Well, if you think I'm doing it too much, maybe you need to get used to being appreciated more. Maybe you need to be fawned over a little bit. Go get yourself a fawn and put it over you. Or under. No, don't do that. Never mind. I take it all back. Just always remember that rock and roll is the best. And so are you.
Please remember to replace the speaker on the post when you leave the theater.